Welcome to viewers in the UK and around the world as we bring you a second day of special coverage following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Britain's longest-serving monarch died yesterday at the age of 96 at Balmoral in Scotland. Flags are flying at half-mast on landmark buildings around the UK and across the Commonwealth. The last hour, Buckingham Palace has announced a period of royal mourning will be observed until 7 days after the Queen's funeral, the date of which will be confirmed in due course. On this programme, we'll bring you the latest reaction from Balmoral to Buckingham Palace and across the world. We're also looking ahead at a day of events marking the death of Queen Elizabeth and preparing for her state funeral. Well, today, King Charles III will travel from Balmoral to London with his wife, Camilla, now Queen Consort. The new King will hold an audience with the Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Parliament will gather at noon for MPs to pay their respects to the Queen. Also at midday, bells will toll in tribute to the Queen at Westminster Abbey, St Paul's Cathedral and Windsor Castle, among other places across the nations. At 1 p.m, gun salutes will be fired in Hyde Park, Edinburgh Castle and elsewhere. There will be 96 rounds fired, one for each year of the Queen's life. Later today, the King is also due to make his first televised address to the nation. It will be his first address, of course, as head of state. And let me show you this image we've just received from Aberdeen Airport. You can see there, that's Prince Harry boarding a plane to London. He arrived at Balmoral at approximately 8 p.m. last night and left just after 8 this morning. Well, our royal correspondent Daniella Ralph has been looking back at the final days and weeks of the Queen's life.
The final images we have, Queen Elizabeth II still carrying out duties into her final days. On Tuesday, at Balmoral, she welcomed the new Prime Minister. These photos, the record of her last official engagement, bringing to an end 7 decades of service. Yesterday afternoon at Aberdeen Airport, several senior members of the royal family arrived to be with the Queen. The Duke of Cambridge drove the Duke of York and Earl and Countess of Wessex to Balmoral. Prince Charles, the new King, was already there with his wife and his sister, Princess Anne. Harry, the Duke of Sussex, arrived separately later in the evening. Here in the UK this week with his wife for a number of charity events, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, did not accompany him to Scotland. At 6:30, in a statement of just 26 words, Buckingham Palace announced the Queen had died peacefully earlier in the afternoon. As is tradition, the statement was attached to the palace gates by 2 footmen, as tribute to Britain's longest reigning monarch began.
Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
And heartfelt words too from the leader of the opposition.
For the vast majority of us, the late Queen has been simply the Queen, the only Queen, above all else, our Queen. As we mourn her loss, we should also treasure her life, our longest serving and greatest ever monarch. Above the clashes of politics, she stood not for what the nation fought over, but what it agreed upon.
Cheered by onlookers, one of the Queen's last royal engagements was in July, with her daughter Princess Anne opening a new state-of-the-art hospice in Berkshire. But these kinds of visits had become rare over the past year, as the Queen relied on her walking stick, her mobility compromised. The royal household had tried to adapt to keep her active and visible. A golf buggy at the Chelsea Flower Show helped the Queen stay comfortable. but she had become noticeably thinner and frailer, something that severely limited her involvement in her own Platinum Jubilee, although her sense of fun as part of those celebrations was undiminished.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich? I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Happy Jubilee, ma'am. And thank you for everything.
That's very kind.
Now, as we remember and reflect, the royal family enters a period of mourning. A state funeral is expected within the next 2 weeks. It will be a period of time when aspects of national life are put on hold. Daniella Ralph, BBC News.
And it's expected that the Queen's coffin will lie in state in Westminster Hall before that state funeral, allowing members of the public to pay their own personal respects. Well, as news of the Queen's death spread around the world, many people have continued to pay their respects to the monarch considered to be the face of Britain for the past 70 years. The bells of Sydney Town Hall in Australia tolled 96 times, one for each year of her life. And in the Japanese capital, Tokyo, mourners laid flowers outside the British Embassy. World leaders have also been paying their tributes. Here's the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
It is with the deepest of sorrow that we learn today of the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She was our Queen for almost half of Canada's existence, and she had an obvious, deep, and abiding love and affection for Canadians.
Well, Annita McVeigh, my colleague, is at the Queen's estate at Balmoral in Scotland, of course, where the Queen passed away yesterday. Annita, we know that Prince Harry, he is, we think, on his way back to London.
Clive, yes, that's right. He left Balmoral here a little while ago, and I believe he is at Aberdeen Airport as we speak on his return journey to London. As far as we are aware, the rest of the royal family, that immediate royal family who travelled to be with the Queen yesterday here at Balmoral, they are still here, but we do expect the new king, as we must get used to saying, to leave here along with the Queen Consort Camilla a little later today to return to London, also where he'll have many duties to undertake while mourning the loss of his mother. This is a place that she loved so well. She spent many periods during her childhood here, part of her honeymoon here, and of course holidayed here at Balmoral every summer. And this morning we've seen a steady and growing stream of people coming with floral tributes. I had a little look at some of those earlier. One simply said, "Amazing lady, God bless." Another had the words, "Just thanks," written on them. Another had the Robbie Burns poem, "My Heart's in the Highlands," attached to the bouquet. Well, let's talk a little bit more now about what we know about the movements of the royal family and what is going to happen in the days ahead with our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell, who's with me. So, Sarah, first of all, what more do we know about the royals who are still here at Balmoral and what their movements might be?
Well, I mean, as you know, Annita, yesterday it became clear that something was really serious because members of the royal family rushed to be here yesterday. So Prince Charles and Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, were already in Scotland on engagement, so they were here relatively quickly. And then a private jet arrived with Prince William, who's now the heir to the throne, with the Earl and Countess of Wessex, and also with Andrew, the Duke of York. So that meant that all of her children were here, Prince William, and then later in the evening yesterday, Prince Harry arrived. So as far as we're aware, apart from Prince Harry, we saw him leaving around about 8 o'clock, just after 8 o'clock this morning. All of the rest of the royals are there, and one must imagine it's been an incredibly sad evening for them behind the castle, and also not just them, but the staff and the people here at Balmoral who have known the Queen for such a long time, have worked for the Queen for such a long time. So this is very much a period of grieving moving. But as we've been saying this morning, of course, when the Queen died, King Charles III immediately acceded the throne, and with that comes the roles and responsibility, and part of that in effect is leading the process going forward now. So he will be returning to London with the new Queen Consort, and that process gets underway.
And what details are emerging about that process, about what lies ahead in the next days and week or so, Sarah?
Yes, indeed. Well, we expect to hear an address from him later today. There will be a service at St Paul's Cathedral. But we have had the first email from Buckingham Palace, and I think what will happen is that all of these details, which have been long in the planning, but they all need to be finalised and they all needed to be signed off by the new king. So now they've started to be published, and I think over the coming days we'll have this trickle of information which will tell us exactly what we can expect. So, for example, just after 9 o'clock this morning, we had an email from Buckingham Palace which outlined details to do with the mourning and condolence arrangements at the royal residences. So it's saying, following the death of Her Majesty the Queen, it is His Majesty the King's wish that a period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. Now, the date of that funeral will be released at some point. It hasn't been released just yet. And just to point out, royal mourning is not the same as national mourning. So that is the royal mourning to be observed by members of the royal family, royal household staff and representatives of the royal household, as well as some members of the military. There are also details about flags at royal residences, which will remain at half-mast, the royal gun salutes, which are going to happen at 1 o'clock today in royal parks. Talking about the closure of royal residences, floral tributes where people, because obviously lots of people, as we've seen here at Buckingham Palace, at Windsor Castle, will be leaving flowers, and the details of where they should leave them and where those flowers might be taken to. And finally, on books of condolence, there are no official books of condolence, actual physical books of condolence at royal residences, but if you go onto the royal website, there is already an online book of condolence where I'm sure many people will want to leave their thoughts with the passing of the Queen.
Sarah, thank you very much. Sarah Campbell, our royal correspondent. And just as I speak to Sarah, I can see in the background people coming and going with more floral tributes to the Queen. As Sarah was mentioning, Prince Harry left here shortly after 8 o'clock this morning. Let's just go to Aberdeen Airport, and our reporter Iain MacInnes is there. Iain, has Prince Harry has his plane set off to return to London yet? Do you know?
Not quite yet. I can just see it on the runway at the moment, just preparing to leave. You can hear the usual buzz of aircraft here, but in the last 45 minutes or so, we saw Prince Harry arrive. He was taken into the VIP area of the airport, and then he boarded that flight ready to make his way down to Heathrow. It's just on the apron as we speak just now, preparing to head off towards London Heathrow. It's only a little over 12 hours since he arrived here. It was a busy day at the airport here yesterday, with many senior royals coming here as news broke of the Queen's health, and we do expect it to be a busy day to come as we prepare for the new king to be here and to make his way to London from the airport here.
OK, Iain, thank you for that update. Well, here in Scotland, around the UK, and of course in many places around the world, tributes will continue to be paid to mark the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, the end of her long reign. Here in Scotland, in Aberdeen, church bells will ring at noon, as well as in churches all around the UK, and at 1 o'clock when those gun salutes take place at Edinburgh Castle. 96 rounds will be fired at 10-second intervals around for every year of Queen Elizabeth's life. Here at Balmoral, as I say, people I know will be coming in a steady stream through the day. We've heard that Aberdeenshire Council have laid on shuttle buses to bring people from towns like Ballater and Braemar. Of course, the Queen loved to attend the Braemar Games each year, but was unable to do that this year. To bring people here to the gates of Balmoral to pay their respects and to leave tributes to the Queen. And then, of course, we're looking out for the point at which the new king leaves Balmoral with the Queen Consort Camilla a little later on today. Extraordinary to think that we are less than 24 hours into hearing that news from the Queen's doctors yesterday, that they were worried about her health, the concerns growing with the news that members of the royal family were travelling here to be with her. And so her eldest son arrived as Prince Charles. He will leave today as King Charles III, mourning his mother, but taking on the huge responsibilities of the monarch. Back to you, Clive.
Annita, we're going to stay with some of the pictures of people leaving flowers, candles, cards, messages of condolence, individual tokens, of course, of affection, for the only monarch that many of those people, frankly, have known. And this, a scene that's replicated at Windsor Castle, of course, the Queen's favourite residence and her main residence, actually, but also too at Buckingham Palace. And I think we can now go over there to talk to my colleague Jane Hill, who's standing by. Jane, London cabbies, prickly bunch at the best of times. They all parked up their vehicles on the Mall last night in silent tribute, and we know that throughout the evening last night, despite the rain, people have been turning up still. And just paint a picture of the scene for us today where you are.
Yes, and the crowds really have been continuing to grow and grow over the last few hours, Clive. We've been here since very early this morning. At that point, just a handful of people, as you might expect. But in the last couple of hours, my goodness, really very, very many people deep. If you look at the railings there, just as you were reflecting at Balmoral, so many flowers now already. It's a beautiful sight in many ways. A sad one as well, of course, a poignant one. And what is so striking is that there's almost two distinct things going on here at Buckingham Palace here today. The side where I'm standing, very, very noisy because there's a lot of construction. There's scaffolding, plinths being put up, barriers being put up for an element of crowd control, because that nods to the formalities that will come in the coming hours and days. And yet, if you stand right at the palace itself and you stand at the railings and you look at the flowers and read all the cards and messages that are attached to them, I was there about an hour and a half ago or so ago, and it was almost silent, certainly very, very quiet. A lot of people taking photos, as you might expect, but equally a lot of people just standing quietly, some of them just looking at the floor, thinking, taking it in, absorbing that change of history that we are all now witnessing and living through. There were people in tears, men and women in tears, and people of all generations. And much earlier this morning here on BBC News, we spoke to a whole family, 3 generations of a family, that had got up at 4 o'clock in the morning because the little girl had to go to school, but she'd written a letter to the royal family to say sorry that they were all sad, and she wanted to leave that here on her way to school this morning. And that just gives you a sense of, I think, what we are going to see throughout the day here at Buckingham Palace, and I guess throughout many, many days to come. As you pointed out, there were thousands of people out here, exactly where I'm standing, late last night in the rain. And our correspondent Tim Muffett was talking to some of them.
An event we all knew would come one day. But for so many, one that is so profoundly sad.
It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking.
What did she mean to you?
The Queen means everything to me like my mum means to me. She was a fantastic lady, she'll always be a fantastic lady, she'll always be a part of my life forever, and I'll never forget her.
She meant a lot to me. For someone my age, I've got quite old grandparents who were born in the 1917 and 22, so she was part of their lives too. So talking to them, they knew her growing up, and it takes a thread back to that sort of era. And now I hear people talking about a king and a coronation, and it puts conversations I had with them in my head of when they would talk about a king, a coronation. So it feels very strange to have this person that's been the head of everything in my life go.
The McGrath family are from Dublin and are on holiday in London.
Well, our two countries have been so close over so many centuries, and we've had a tough past, but it goes without saying that she was an iconic woman and a role model for women of all ages and all colours and beliefs. And My mum has been a fan of the Queen for so many years. She was a fan of her integrity, and she's very sad. Yeah. Yeah, we shed a tear today.
Throughout her reign, Queen Elizabeth II was unwavering in her dedication to her role as monarch. And for so many people here tonight, it is vital to honour and respect the role she played in our national story.
It's very important. The Queen has done so much for us for the past 70 years, and I think that it's our kind of duty as the British people and just generally to show our respect to someone who served us for 70 years.
She means a family. Like since my boyhood, childhood, while I was in Bangladesh, I saw her through the TV. I really do feel emotional. And as a Muslim, I prayed for her after my prayer today.
We all knew this day would come one day.
Yeah.
And yet it still feels shocking and it still feels profound, doesn't it?
Yes.
How are you feeling?
I think she's a kind of mother figure to everyone, and she was so, I can't really put it into words. As a nation, we're mourning the loss of the Queen, but for the King and his family, yeah, they have lost their mum, their grandmother, their great-grandmother, and so that's really sad for them. You know, we have to remember that she was their family.
The reign of King Charles III has begun. But for many, the reign of Queen Elizabeth II will never be forgotten. Tim Muffett, BBC News, at Buckingham Palace.
And many of the cards and messages that I was reading that are attached to the flowers on the railings echo a lot of what we heard there. If you had to distill all those cards, they would, in essence, just say thank you. And a lot of them making reference to the fact that the Queen was always there. One card said, "You are the only monarch I've ever known. I really thought you were invincible." And I think we will see a lot more of those sentiments echoed today. For now, from here at Buckingham Palace, back to you, Clive.
Okay. Jane, thank you. Jane Hill there reporting for us. And Tim Muffett there summing up some of the thoughts of those people who, throughout the evening, were down at Buckingham Palace paying their respects to the departed monarch. And of course they're going to be paying their respects as well at Westminster today. And Nick Eardley is at Downing Street, our political correspondent. Nick, both houses of Parliament is going to be sitting, MPs and peers able to pay their respects.
Yeah, they are, Clive. The Cabinet has just been meeting actually to pay its own respects to Queen Elizabeth II. As you say, this afternoon MPs and members of the House of Lords will be doing the same into tomorrow, when senior members of Parliament will also be able to take an oath to the new King. It has been quite a remarkable week here. You know, when you think of some of the political turbulence we've seen over the last few years, one of the few signs of continuity has been the Queen, those weekly audiences that she had with Prime Ministers for so many decades. And it's been really interesting listening to some of the accounts that senior politicians have been giving of the time they spent with Queen Elizabeth over the past few hours. We've heard in particular from former Prime Ministers. Theresa May was saying this morning that the Queen was incredibly knowledgeable at those meetings, that she was always well read on the issues of the day. She paid a lot of attention to those papers she got from the government. We never get the exact details of those meetings, Clive, because they are supposed to be private, they are confidential. But Sir John Major, another former Prime Minister, did give a bit of an insight into what went on behind those closed doors in those meetings with Her Majesty, when he said that they were often full of humour and amusement. And it is one of those things you often hear from politicians who spent time with the Queen, that they felt that she was someone who gave them quite a lot of guidance, quite a lot of support in their political roles. Of course, constitutionally she stood above politics, but there was always that sense that she was there to support Prime Ministers. And if you want a sense of just how long Queen Elizabeth was part of our national life, it's incredible to think that the person who lived in there when she became Queen was Winston Churchill, her first Prime Minister. There have been another 14 since, 15 in total. And one of the last things the Queen did as monarch was to meet Liz Truss on Tuesday at Balmoral to approve her new cabinet and ministerial appointments. And those cabinet ministers have been meeting here this morning to pay tribute to Her Majesty. There will be many more tributes over the next few days.
This was not a monarch, the Queen, who was disengaged. She took her constitutional duty very seriously and read all those papers that were presented to her in the red box. Now, of course, Liz Truss is going to be dealing with King Charles III, and it'll be a weekly audience with him that she'll be having.
A big change for both of them, actually. This is the first time in history that the Prime Minister and the monarch have both changed in such a short period of time. And I suppose it's a sense of how historic this week really is. That sense of a new Prime Minister in Downing Street, a new monarch soon in Buckingham Palace as well. And, you know, there was always, as I say, that sense that the Queen was someone who gave great counsel to her Prime Ministers and to her Privy Councillors, other senior politicians who met her. Boris Johnson, a few months ago when he was still Prime Minister, paid tribute to the Queen ahead of the Platinum Jubilee, and he talked about the level of detail that she went into, that she had incredible recall for things that had been happening, events around the world, and also things like capitals of obscure countries that maybe wouldn't always come to mind. The Queen always had them in her mind. And at the time, Mr. Johnson reflected on the fact that the Queen has really seen it all. You know, when she came into her period as monarch, the Second World War was a not so distant memory. The NHS was in its infancy, and she's been through huge political change in the UK, be that, you know, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which of course affected the royal family, up into the Good Friday Agreement, devolution in the UK, the entry and exit from the European Union, right up until the recent COVID pandemic and the economic challenges the country is facing at the moment. The Queen, although she wasn't at the forefront of politics, she was always in the background of those huge historic political moments. And it'll be a big change, yes, for the royals, but also for the way that Downing Street operates, to be speaking to a new monarch, for that weekly audience to be with King Charles III rather than Queen Elizabeth II. The first time in 70 years that a monarch will be meeting someone other than Queen Elizabeth to have those conversations about daily life and political change in the UK.
Okay, Nick, thank you for that. Our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley there, reporting live from Downing Street. The Queen, of course, was the constitutional monarch leading Australia. And I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, here in the studio. It's good to see you. Thanks for being with us. We've heard a lot about the Queen's sense of humour. And I want to start with that, actually, because I spoke to Sir John Major last night, who was talking about her sort of devilish, impish sense of humour. And just take us back to the last time you actually met the Queen.
Well, it was after I'd left office. I was here in London. For my sins, I'm on the International Advisory Board of Chatham House here in London. And the Queen was there with Prince Philip opening a new extension to Chatham House. And so there was a small reception for a few of us afterwards. And she said to me in her own disarming way, "Hello, what are you doing here?" And to which I said, "Well, ma'am, last time I looked, it was still a free country." And she said, then Prince Philip came up and said, "What, since you left office, you in exile or something?" And I said, No, I said, Your Royal Highness, the last exile was when your forebears sent some of us to Australia as crims.
Oh.
And so she then laughed and whacked him on the shoulder and said, don't mind him.
It's lovely to hear these stories coming out now about the Queen. Because, of course, there is a solemnity to the occasion. She has passed away. She was 96. We now have a new king. But her importance and in ensuring the relevance of the Commonwealth has been incredible over the 70 years of her reign.
Many conversations I had with Her Majesty over the years, here in the UK, but also at Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings. The one enduring theme from these conversations was her passion for the Commonwealth, and not just because of its historical thread, not just because of its force for continuity, but because she saw it as part of the fabric of international democracy. So we would have many conversations about problems emerging, countries unnamed, where democratic processes are under challenge and what to do about them. And I remember assuming for a period the chairpersonship of the Commonwealth because we had to get over a problem in Sri Lanka at the time. But this was an enduring passion of hers. And so I think all members of the Commonwealth, all 53 member states, owe her a debt of gratitude.
But it wasn't just because she was the constitutional head of these countries. It was also because she believed in these countries working together, and indeed countries working together in general, would promote the cause of peace and strength and stability. And that's an important theme of why she felt the Commonwealth was such an important institution to push.
You're right. It's not just the soft power, let's call it British democracy, sort of through the veins of the Commonwealth of Nations. It's also this unlikely gaggle of states, 20 or so from...
It's quite a spread, isn't it?
Southern Africa. Yeah. You've got the Caribbean. You've got us malcontents in the Antipodes, and all points in between, India, etc. Yeah. But her view and her vision was we can fashion things through this. So I remember, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the lead up to one of the first big climate conferences in Copenhagen, 2009. Her passion for seeing the Commonwealth begin to forge a consensus on the road to Copenhagen. Right. So she did see it as a building block towards internationalism when there was so much pulling the world apart in the different directions.
And her affection for Aussies. You know, she talked about the honest, rugged and creative land and Australians who occupied that land on one of her visits. She visited every single state, every single territory. There was a deep affection she had for that particular country.
Yeah, and it was reciprocated in Oz. I mean, I'm from rural Queensland, so as a kid growing up, I remember going to a slide night, as you did in the 1960s, when your aunt, my auntie Phyllis, would throw these slides onto the wall, which was of the Queen's 53 royal visit. I'm pleased to say 54 royal visit, before I was born. And this was totally blurred as the Queen sped by in a car. But for people like her, this was part of continuity and being part of a wider family. So Australians, right across the board, Republicans, constitutional monarchists, the affection for this extraordinary woman was genuine and deep. Here you would say she was the country's matriarch. We thought she was our nana. So it was felt here. So.
Indeed, absolutely. We've already heard that there was a gun salute at Parliament House in Canberra for each of the years that the Queen was alive. Kevin Wood, it's a pleasure to have you in. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you on what's a solemn day for all of us.
Indeed. Many thanks. Now, we are going to move on and speak to one of Britain's leading historians, Professor Sir Tom Devine. Tom, it's good to see you. Thanks for being with us. Just give us your reflections now on what perhaps many people in Scotland may be thinking.
Well, this is an extremely solemn and sad day for the Scottish people, because you were talking just a few minutes ago about Elizabeth II's affection for Australia. But by any standards, she had a deep reflection for Scotland. And I think it's not only poignant, but also extremely significant that she spent her last days in my country and her last days on one of the places, and possibly even the place that she revered and loved above all, the Balmoral estate in the Highlands of Scotland.
Tom, it's been an interesting relationship, obviously, between Buckingham Palace, the royal family's relationship with Scotland. But of course, it was the Queen who helped usher in that period that we're now living in of constitutional, to a degree, independence and self-rule from Holyrood in opening up the Scottish Parliament. How significant a moment was it that the Queen was responsible for doing that?
Well, it was deeply significant, of course, because she was the head of state in Britain. But of course, the other dimension, which is extremely important to mention, is that it must have given her considerable personal pleasure. Time and time again, when she came back to open a new session of the Scottish Parliament, she emphasised the affection and love which she and her late husband had, Prince Philip, for this country. And you've got to remember that the Queen's blood connections to Scotland go back for centuries. We can even trace her pedigree, if you will, her royal pedigree, back to the medieval times of King Robert the Bruce, the great hero king of Scotland during the Wars of Independence, ironically enough, against England.
Indeed, I think it's the case, you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, that she's descended from more Scottish royals than English royals.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is an element, and not the only element, but it's certainly one significant element in the love that she and the rest of her family have for Scotland. I mean, this love affair between royalty and particularly the Highlands of Scotland started during the reign of Queen Victoria. Every monarch since then has loved to come to Balmoral, but I think the stamp and the love that the late Queen had for Scotland, and particularly for the Highlands of Scotland, was second to none, apart from Queen Victoria in the 19th century, who, as I said a few seconds ago, began the love affair with between royalty and Scotland.
Yeah, the first monarch to visit Shetland since the Vikings. I wonder how you would characterize...
York, for example, is no longer with us.
Yeah.
They often put into... I own a house in the island of Mull, and they often put into the islands to beaches that no other human being would visit during that period, and have picnics on the Hebridean beaches. So they have seen parts of Scotland which very few Scots have actually seen.
Yeah, I wonder as well, Tom, now as we look to the future, obviously, how you see the relationship between King Charles III and Scotland. He, just like his mother, had and has a very deep affection for the people.
Yes. Well, that will help them. I mean, there are two things, Clive. I think in the first instance, which will go on for, I think, a considerable time, there will be tremendous support for the royal family, and in particular the new king, because, you know, he's not simply taking on this enormous burden, but he's also mourning the death of his beloved mother. And so that support will be there. In the medium to long term, we'll probably have to wait and see. But as far as the Scottish connection is concerned, that will remain durable because he has got so many interests and has had so many interests in Scotland. But I mean, to go back briefly to his mother, I met her obviously when she knighted me in Holyrood Palace in 2015. And she said in the few words afterwards, the ceremony was coming to an end, she said, it has been a particular pleasure for me to give the accolade of knighthood to a scholar for his contribution to, and she emphasized the next two words, emphatically Scottish history. And that seemed to me to bring out in words and almost in emotion the love she has for my country.
Indeed.
Or had.
Thank you so much, Professor Sir Tom Devine. It's good to get your perspective, as ever, on what obviously is a very, very sad day for many, many people, and of course for many people in Scotland too. Thank you. Let's turn our attentions now to another royal residence. We've moved from Balmoral in Scotland. We're now going to go to Windsor Castle. Some have suggested it's perhaps the Queen's favourite royal residence, and where she spent many a happy time. Our correspondent Duncan Kennedy is there for us now. Duncan, we've seen the flowers, the cards, the candles and so on that have been left at all the royal residences around this United Kingdom. And I wonder what the scene is where you are now, given that this was perhaps the Queen's favourite residence.
Yes, it was. I think whereas you could describe Buckingham Palace as the office home, I think here it would be the other way round. I think it was the home office, the place she came to, knew very well, made her first broadcast from Windsor Castle when she was a 14-year-old during the Second World War in October 1940, and thereafter used it as a home, as a place to bring up her family. What's going on, Clive, here, you've been to those other places, just like there. The extraordinary thing is that, as you can see behind me, there are dozens, if not hundreds of people, but it's very quiet. There have been the grass cutters, the tractor-mounted grass cutters, clipping the lawns in preparation for future events over the next few days. There have been the jets coming out of Heathrow, but otherwise it's just the curious, the interested, the reflective. People just coming to bring those flowers you mentioned, to leave their written notes. And among those to do that this morning are a father and daughter, Dean and Melissa Moran. It is extraordinary, the silence here. Why have you come?
We live locally. Just wanted to come and pay our respects. She's just entwined in all our lives. You have to come and pay your respects. She's not just UK's Queen, she's the whole world's Queen.
You've told me your age. It's an advanced age of some sorts there, Dean. Here is your daughter. We won't ask ages, but clearly the Queen had an intergenerational appeal. What does she mean to you, Melissa?
She means a lot to me. I used to work in the castle a couple of years ago. I've met her at Buckingham Palace at Christmas events. She's also given me Christmas presents that I can then hand down to my daughter. So yeah, she'll be in our lives for a very long time, and it's history.
Can you remember what she said to you? What were words?
Not really. I was very overwhelmed, but she puts people at ease. She's very nice. She's just a lovely woman.
What is it about it? Is it because she was royal, the monarch, a woman, a figurehead? What particularly appealed to you about her?
She's just a role model, really. She's very sophisticated. She's just an inspiration for all women, and yeah, definitely one of the best historical figures in the world.
It's just started to get a few drops of rain here. Did you, Dean, expect to find yourself down here outside Windsor Castle on a Friday morning doing this?
Yes. As soon as I knew she passed away, my wife came last night. Just wanted to show our respect today, and she meant the world to everyone, really.
We were speaking earlier, it's not fame, it's not celebrity, it's something else, isn't it, that appeals?
Something above that. It's just something everyone looks up to. She's just been there for the whole of my life. And like I said, my dad was in the army. He used to work up in the castle when I was a child. So, yeah, it's just been in my life since I've been born.
Dean and Melissa and 2-year-old Mia down there, thank you very much for waiting for us. Thank you very much. Just one of several people we've spoken to. As I keep saying there, Clive, it's intergenerational, the appeal of the Queen. Not everybody we've met this morning has been a royalist by any stretch of the imagination. I think she was just curious to people because she was an interesting person. She too had met so many famous figures across the world down all these many decades of her life. She was just a fascinating figure for these people. And as one person put it to me this morning, it felt like she was family.
Interesting. Everyone's mum. All right. Thank you. Duncan Kennedy there at Windsor. Well, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has sent his condolences to King Charles, saying the Queen had rightfully enjoyed the love and respect of her subjects, as well as authority on the world stage. He added, "I wish you courage and resilience in the face of this difficult, irreparable loss. May I ask you to pass on sincere condolences and support to members of the royal family and the entire people of Great Britain." Well, Mr. Putin, of course, met Queen Elizabeth on a number of occasions. He was hosted by the Queen and Prince Philip during a state visit to the UK in 2003, where he reportedly showed up 14 minutes late to their meeting. I don't think any grudges were held, but our correspondent Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow for us. Steve, interesting that the Kremlin and Mr. Putin felt they should be sending condolences despite everything in relation to the situation involving Ukraine.
Yes, it's no secret, of course, that UK-Russian relations are strained at the moment, to say the least. But that has been put aside, at least for today. You mentioned the telegram of condolences sent by President Putin to King Charles. Also, a few minutes ago, Vladimir Putin's spokesman said this. He said that Queen Elizabeth was highly respected in Russia. She came across the world for her wisdom, her international authority. There is a big deficit of these qualities right now on the world stage, he said. Also, warm words today in the Russian papers, this morning's Russian press, about Queen Elizabeth. For example, this is Kommersant. It's the front page news in this paper today, and the paper says that the Queen's death is the end of an epoch, not only for the British people, but the whole world. And on my way to work, Clive, I passed by the British Embassy in Moscow and stopped there to see a makeshift shrine. People have been coming to lay flowers, to pay their respects to the Queen. Not only flowers, people were lighting candles too and leaving notes there. I think that's a sign of what she meant, actually, to many people in Russia.
I mean, the funeral will, of course, be a huge international event. If an invitation is extended to the Russian leadership to attend the funeral, and we don't know if that's going to happen, is it likely that someone would turn up?
I think that's unlikely, Clive. I mean, already today, the Kremlin has said that President Putin will not be going to the funeral. So I think that can be ruled out, particularly with the state of UK-Russian relations, what they are. The other thing I'd say is a lot's been talked about the longevity of the Queen's reign, these 70 years, this incredible period of change and often of tension, geopolitical tension, particularly in relations between East and West. I mean, she spanned such an amazing period of history. I find it incredible to think that when her father, King George VI, died in 1952 and she became Queen, the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, was still in power. And the Cold War back then was still in its infancy. The Berlin Wall hadn't even been built. And for the first 3.5 decades of her reign, the Cold War dominated this East-West tension. But when change came, the Queen very much reflected that change. So, for example, when the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came over to the UK in 1989 and she hosted him, that was a sign that the Cold War was coming to an end. And when the Queen went to Moscow in 1994, becoming the first British monarch to visit Russia since the 1917 Communist Revolution, that was a sign that UK-Russian relations were getting stronger. And when Vladimir Putin came over to the UK in 2003 and the Queen and Putin were in the carriage together, again, that was a sign of hope that Moscow and London were building a stronger relationship. Unfortunately, that didn't last.
Indeed. Very interesting. Stalin was still in power when she came to the throne. OK, Steve, many thanks. Steve Rosenberg there, our Russia editor in Moscow. Well, member states of the Commonwealth have been paying tribute to the Queen, who was head of the voluntary association of about 50 nations. We heard Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, in the studio, speaking to us a little bit earlier. This was, of course, formed at the end of the British Empire, and President Kenyatta of Kenya was one of several African leaders whose countries gained independence during the Queen's reign. In a letter of condolence, President Kenyatta said Queen Elizabeth had been a towering icon of selfless service and humanity. Let's talk to our correspondent, Catherine Byaruhanga, who's live in Nairobi. Catherine, it was Kenya, a hunting lodge, wasn't it, I think, where the Queen heard that her father had died and that she was now going to become Elizabeth II. And Kenya, I think, has been important in the royal family's life and is a place where I suspect many Kenyans will be sad and mournful given her passing.
Yes, good afternoon here from Nairobi at the British High Commissioner's residence in Kenya. As you mentioned there, Clive, Kenya will always hold a special place in the Queen's journey. It was here when she was on a visit with her husband, Prince Philip, in 1952, that she got the news that her father had sadly passed away and that she was now Queen. The fairy tale goes that she was at the Treetops Lodge. She went up one night as a princess and came down the next day as a queen. And here at the British High Commissioner's residence, a condolence book has been opened up. We've seen some dignitaries, ambassadors coming here to pay their respects. There have also been Kenyan politicians who've come here to mark this remarkable reign, a 70-year reign by the Queen. And also in the newspapers this morning in Kenya, we have the Standard newspaper. You can see the front page, a picture of the Queen covering the front page here. There's also the Daily Nation newspaper, which talks about the Queen's death marking the end of one of the longest reigns by a head of state anywhere in the world. And one thing that the newspapers also talk about is this relationship between the Queen and the continent. She came to power at a time when many countries on this continent were agitating for independence from Britain, not least here in Kenya. So there are people who are choosing to use this moment to remember this painful past that the continent has had with Britain. But we've also seen other leaders across Africa talking about this wonderful friendship that the Queen had built with so many of them. Remember, over her 70-year reign, she had shaken hands with so many African leaders across the continent, even those who came from countries that weren't former British colonies. So, for example, we've heard from the president of Gabon, Ali Bongo. This was a new addition to the Commonwealth earlier this year, and he talked about the Queen's great friendship with the continent and the fact that the continent also showed her affection.
Catherine, thank you. Catherine Byaruhanga there outside the High Commission in Nairobi in Kenya. As Catherine was saying, they're a place dear to the heart of the Queen. We know Prince Harry has already left Aberdeenshire, or at least we had pictures of him at Aberdeenshire Airport having left Balmoral earlier today. And we know that at some point King Charles III and his Queen Consort, Camilla, will be on their way back to London at some point, and they could well be heading to Buckingham Palace, where our correspondent, my colleague, in fact, Jane Hill, is there for us now. Jane.
Hello, Clive. Thank you. As people continue to stream, I mean, there are thousands of people here at the palace now, and as I look to my right, people streaming down the Mall, and that pile of flowers and floral tributes that we've seen is just continuing to grow. Let's discuss this moment in history with Sir Anthony Selden, who is here with me at the palace, historian, biographer. Sir Anthony, some of the people we've been hearing from today who've made the effort to come here, I was really struck by a family where they looked at the little girl who was with them, still at school, and said, we're quite moved because this little girl is only now going to know kings. And the grandmother said, we've been so lucky that as she put it, that we've had 70 years of a queen. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, the sweep of history that we've seen, the longevity of the Queen's reign.
Well, that's right. I mean, one of the great things that made the Queen so happy was she secured the succession with Charles, with William, with George, deep into the 22nd century. But you're right, they are all blokes. We're going to have king in succession. And yet if we look back at history, some of our greatest monarchs have been Elizabeth I, Queen, and Victoria, Queen, and some of the longest serving as well. And that's saying something, I think, important about British history and the position of women and women as leaders. So that little girl will at least be able to look back and think, I saw the longest surviving monarch in British history and the second longest monarch in world history after Louis XIV. That she was alive and saw it, and that very same woman, the first of her 15 prime ministers, Winston Churchill, born in 1874, and when he was alive, he knew people born in the 18th century. So there we are, the 18th to the 22nd century. This is unique in world history, that sense of continuity provided by the Crown. The Queen is dead, long live the King, without a heartbeat. It just happens.
And that longevity, though, that brings stability, doesn't it? It gives stability. That's why so many of the cards on the railings say, "You are the only monarch I have ever known." And so does that partly speak to why we are seeing the crowds here today that we are seeing? Because there's no one to see in Buckingham Palace. There's nothing there. People are laying flowers. But what is it that draws these people to say, I just had to be here, which is what people are telling us?
Because it's at the heart of British history. The monarchy has been there since 1066. We've just lost that longest serving monarch. This is a moment when history stops, history pauses, the clock stands still. And people, they don't quite know why they're here. It's like Diana, almost exactly 25 years ago. The crowd, just since we've been talking, have been growing and growing. It's a real, it's an enormous number now down here. They're looking for something. What, I don't know, but the consolation of others. They're asking questions, they feel bereft. There's a sense that they've lost part of their history, but also part of their family history. Somebody that their mother, their grandmother loved, going all the way back to the Second World War. There she was with her father, George VI, that extraordinary sense of continuity and who we are as a people on earth.
Sir Anthony Selden, I hope we can talk again because there is the future to talk about as well, which I would really like to address with you. Thank you very much for your time for now. Sir Anthony Selden, the historian and biographer. And King Charles, of course, is due to come to the capital at some point later today. We will have more from here at Buckingham Palace. For now, Clive, I'll hand you back to you.
Jane, thank you, and thanks to Sir Anthony Selden as well. And King Charles III, he will be addressing the nation, we understand, tonight, potentially from Buckingham Palace, but it could well be from Windsor. It will, of course, be his first address as King. Now, I'm pleased to say that my colleague, the BBC's Laura Koonsberg, is here, our former political editor, and we're going to talk about the wider ramifications politically of what's happened over the last day or so. And I think the first thing to stress, Laura, is just how engaged the Queen was, and frankly how engaged the King now has to be in the affairs of state.
Absolutely. I mean, as a modern monarch in the 20th and 21st century, of course, there were very clear limits on what the Queen as monarch was allowed to do and not allowed to do. She said herself, I do not give you laws or administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my devotion. And when it comes to politics and the affairs of government, that was a very extensive role. Through all sorts of things, she used to read the full cabinet meetings, highly secret documents every single week. There was the absolutely pivotal audience with the Queen for every single one of her 15 prime ministers. That meeting once a week where the monarch met with the Prime Minister, whoever it was with the day, Churchill, her first Prime Minister, Liz Truss, her last Prime Minister just in the last couple of days, through that extraordinary sweep of history. And for Prime Minister after Prime Minister, we know that that encounter was vital. You know, the Queen would not tell them what to do, but her role was to provide discreet advice. Perhaps one of the only meetings that week where they could be completely sure that they were speaking in confidence, that its contents would never emerge into the public domain. And her role was seen sometimes as perhaps to encourage or gently to warn. And the Queen probably had a better institutional memory of how government works, somebody who is genuinely engaged, spending hours every week going through the red boxes, reading government papers. And for Prime Minister after Prime Minister, she was somebody absolutely crucial to how they made their decisions, whether as a trusted friend. Sometimes there were tensions, no question about that, but something that is a very, very important role, even though only a handful of people still alive would ever have seen that, how it worked behind closed doors.
It's interesting, actually, you point out that question of her basically knowing the ropes, having dealt with 15 prime ministers and prime ministers before whomever happened to be in her presence as the leader at any particular moment in time. She could say, well, I remember when, and perhaps you could do this, and perhaps this might be an option. And that continuity is incredibly instructive and helpful and powerful.
And incredibly rare too.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the sweep of the changes that she lived through, not just as a girl, but then indeed as a monarch. I mean, when she ascended the throne, the UK was still recovering from war, the sort of austerity of the early 50s, then huge social upheaval through the 60s, turbulence and strife in the 70s, and then all the change that came with Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s as we perhaps became a sort of consumer nation. And it's known that there were tensions between those two very strong female, powerful leaders. But the Queen herself said once of her prime ministers, they unburden themselves. And she said in, I think, typical fashion, if they have problems, one can sometimes help in that way. It's rather nice to feel that one is a sort of sponge and one can put one's point of view, which perhaps they might not have seen it from that angle. But I think, you know, that role really very much behind the scenes, but absolutely critical to the sort of wiring of how our country works. And it's going to be both fascinating, but also hugely important to see how King Charles actually handles that and what his influence may or may not be. There's a question over whether or not he might be some activist king. He's given indications that he will not take those sort of causes that we know he cares about so passionately with him into this new job. But there certainly will be a tension on whether or not how that relationship develops with our new Prime Minister happening at this extraordinary time.
Indeed, it is going to be fascinating to see. Laura, I know you're going to be around throughout the day, so we'll leave it there. Many thanks to you. My colleague Laura Koonsberg there. Welcome to viewers in the UK and around the world as we bring you a second day of special coverage following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest serving monarch, died yesterday at the age of 96 at Balmoral in Scotland. The UK government has announced a period of national mourning which will continue until the end of the Queen's state funeral. Now, the exact date and a carefully choreographed schedule for the coming days is expected to be announced following consultations between King Charles III and royal officials. Well, the King, who spent the night at Balmoral, is now preparing to travel to London with his wife, Camilla, for the first official engagements of his reign. The new King will hold an audience with Prime Minister Liz Truss. Parliament will gather at noon for MPs to pay respects to the Queen. Also at midday, bells will toll in tribute to the Queen at Westminster Abbey, St Paul's Cathedral and Windsor Castle, among other places across the land. At 1 p.m, gun salutes will be fired in Hyde Park, Edinburgh Castle and elsewhere. There will be 96 rounds fired, one for each year of the Queen's life. A public service of remembrance will be held at St Paul's Cathedral in central London. That's at 6 o'clock tonight. The Prime Minister and the Mayor of London are expected to attend. And later today, the King will make his first televised address to the nation. It will be his first, of course, as head of state. Well, on this programme, we'll bring you all the latest updates from Balmoral and Buckingham Palace, of course, as well as reaction from around the world. And we start with this report from Daniel Sanford.
Silently, somberly and thoughtfully, people came through the night to Buckingham Palace, the symbolic centre of the monarchy and the late Queen's London home from World War II to her Platinum Jubilee. As the first dawn of a new era broke, the numbers increased. Many events in the UK are being put on hold as the country enters a lengthy period of official mourning. To a grieving nation, the leader of the Church of England had this advice.
Bring all your grief and anxiety. Bring the sense of loss with complete honesty. Let us not pretend that this is anything but the most enormous change, the most enormous blow, especially to her immediate family. Don't forget them. But my message is, let's not hide the fact that this is an enormous blow. But as Her late Majesty showed us, and as His Majesty is showing and will show us, let us bring that grief and be willing to receive comfort, a fresh abundance of life, and a deep hope for the future.
Most of the Queen's closest family members are still at Balmoral Castle, where she died. Her children, including King Charles III and William, the Duke of Cornwall and Cambridge. So far, Prince Harry has been the only one to leave Balmoral, boarding a plane at Aberdeen Airport to rejoin his wife and children. At Windsor, where the Queen spent most of her final years living in the heart of the historic town, there was a profound sense of loss.
It's very sad.
What does she mean to you?
I think she means everything, doesn't she, to the world. She was everything, wasn't she? She's just an incredible lady, and it's just incredibly sad for her, her family. It's just awful, isn't it?
In the Australian capital, Canberra, a 96-gun salute. One shot for each year of her life. Despite the debate about Australia becoming a republic, she'd also been their queen for more than 70 years.
Today marks the end of an era, the close of the second Elizabethan age. This time of mourning will pass, but the deep respect and warm regard in which Australians have always held for Her Majesty will never fade. May she rest in eternal peace.
In New Zealand too, she was being remembered.
I know I speak for all New Zealanders in conveying our deepest sympathy to members of the royal family and condolences to King Charles III on behalf of the government and New Zealanders at this time of enormous loss. The last days of the Queen's life captures who she was in so many ways, working till the very end on behalf of the people she loved.
And that image of a smiling Queen as she met her 15th and last Prime Minister will endure for many years, whenever the world remembers Britain's longest reigning monarch. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
Well, the Queen embodied the union of the Scottish and English crowns, of course. Scotland, a place very close to her heart. And Annita McVeigh is at the Queen's estate at Balmoral in Scotland, where she passed away, and a place where we know King Charles III and the Queen Consort are preparing to leave at some point today to head back to London for the beginning of the first full day of his reign.
That's right, Clive, and thank you. And let me just bring you up to date with what's happening here immediately behind me. The number of people arriving to lay flowers in tribute to the Queen has been growing steadily throughout the morning. A queue now, in fact, behind me to do that. Just allowing people a little bit of time and space with their thoughts and time to read the messages on the bouquets that are already in place. And interesting to chat to some of the people laying flowers, everybody from dog walkers to toddlers to tourists. I spoke to an American couple earlier here on holiday who said that they really admired the Queen for her grace, her sense of duty and service, and so that was why they wanted to come here today with flowers. I also spoke a little earlier to the fiddler Paul Anderson, who played music at the local church, the kirk, where the royal family would worship while here at Balmoral. He'd also played for her at Balmoral itself, at some of the balls that were held here, and he spoke of one pre-COVID. So just a few years ago, the Queen already in her 90s, and he said that she was up dancing pretty much for every second song. And how much she loved that music, and also about how when she was walking around here or out in the grounds of Balmoral and would meet local people, she would slip very easily into the local dialect. He said that the royals and the Queen loved it here because, people let them be, they didn't bother them, but the royals also loved to talk to local people, he said. And a little earlier we were speaking to local people and asking them for their thoughts on this historic and sad and occasion when people are still trying to come to terms that the Queen is gone.
It's very sad. She's been a monarch for over 70 years and it's history, and we just wanted to be here to share our condolences to the just be part of it, kind of thing. Yeah.
It's really sad news to hear, actually. It's that's the reason we came. We were hoping to pass on our regards or just to be here. So it's kind of sad, actually.
A sad day. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for everybody, I think. I think the whole nation will come together and just, feel the same. Yeah.
Although you never knew her or anything, but her significance was just incredible, and it doesn't really hit home, I don't think, until you hear something like this, and what she meant to us and what she meant to the country. It was absolutely incredible legacy.
Let's just talk a little bit more about the movements of the royal family, because as Clive was mentioning, we are expecting the King, King Charles, to leave here a little later this morning and to travel back to London. He has many duties to undertake today. We can go to Aberdeen Airport, and Ian MacInnes is there. And Ian, of course, the Queen's eldest child, came here yesterday as Prince Charles. He will leave Balmoral as King and head there to the airport to return to all those duties.
Indeed, Annita. This morning we've obviously have a slightly better day than we had yesterday for the arrivals. This morning around 8 o'clock, Prince Harry left Balmoral, we are there, made his way here to Aberdeen Airport and boarded a flight back to London, the first of the royals to head back to London to be with his family. Then later this morning we do expect, as you say, to see King Charles to come here. Maybe the first sight we get of him here at the airport as he makes his way south to London to carry out those engagements. We expect him to come to the airport, possibly by air, and we will from there see him make his way to the royal jet, and he will be heading then to London to carry out those engagements as he begins his reign as the new monarch.
Ian, thank you very much. And with me here at Balmoral, just to find out a little bit more about what the planning is for the next few days and indeed the week or so ahead, is our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell. Sarah, hello again to you. So what are you hearing about the movements of the royal family? We were just talking there about Prince Harry leaving earlier this morning, and of course the new King and Queen Consort will head back to London. And what about the other members of the royal family who are here at Balmoral?
Yes, we know who are here. The Queen's children rushed to be here yesterday afternoon. So Prince Charles, of course, now new King Charles III, the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward and his wife, the Countess of Wessex. So what we know is that Prince Harry, as you say, left just after 8 o'clock this morning. So we're now waiting to hear when the King has left, and that is the next departure we're expecting, because as we've been saying this morning, whilst they are in a period of family grieving, of course it's still 24 hours since we became aware that there was some issue here when the doctors issued that alert suggesting that the Queen's condition had deteriorated. So it is not long, but of course the new King now has to assume the role of King, and that requires several duties. And so he will leave here, he will travel to London, he will have to meet with the Prime Minister, he will have to take part in a service later on today at St Paul's. And he's also going to have to make decisions about the funeral arrangements, because although the plans have been in train for a very long time, he needs to sign those off. And we have had the first details.
Yes, what do we know about those days ahead?
Yeah, exactly. So there was a release following the death of Her Majesty the Queen. This came from Buckingham Palace in the last couple of hours. It is Her Majesty the King's wish that a period of royal mourning will be observed from now until 7 days after the Queen's funeral. Now, the date of that funeral will be confirmed in due course, and also within that release was details about the flags flying at half-mast, books of condolence. The royal website has an online book of condolence that people can sign. There are gun salutes that are due to happen at 1 o'clock today. So gradually, how things will carry out over the next 10 or so days are starting to emerge. Those decisions are starting to be taken.
And Sarah, we were chatting just a little earlier, weren't we, about how Queen was 96. We knew that her health was deteriorating. But on just Tuesday, 3 days ago, we saw that photograph of her with Liz Truss as she asked her to form the next government and become Prime Minister. So the sense of surprise at the events of the last 24 hours.
Yes, I think that's right, that she was 96 years old, a great age. But as you say, the issue was, even though we knew her health had been declining really since October of last year, so almost a year to the day, we suddenly started to have issues where she would be using a walking stick, where she would be cancelling engagements, which she hadn't done by and large throughout her long reign, and she had that stay in hospital. That was last October. And since then, there's just been a stepping back of her duties. But as you say, when we saw her on Tuesday, and this was the first time we'd seen her for a while, because when she comes to Balmoral, one of the things in every year is that it allows her a deal of privacy, that she can spend time away from the cameras. We tend not to see her much when she was in Balmoral. But she looked frail, certainly. She was using her walking stick, but as you say, she was smiling and clearly wanting to carry on with the duties that she had done for all of her reign. And I think that is why people are finding it unsettling and difficult, because this seems to have happened at the end very quickly.
Sarah, thank you very much. Sarah Campbell, our royal correspondent. Balmoral, of course, was a place that the Queen loved dearly from childhood. She spent part of her honeymoon here as well, and it was where she came every summer. Members of the family saying it was where she felt she could be really free and relaxed, spending time with friends and family and her beloved dogs, of course. So it's very fitting that today here at Balmoral we're seeing more and more people arriving to contemplate the events of the past 24 hours, to pay their tributes to a Queen who loved this place so well. Back to you, Clive.
Annita, thank you. Annita McVeigh, my colleague there at Balmoral. All the royal residences, of course, are places of congregation today and probably over the next few days, while the public take in the news that the Queen has died. And of course, many people will be wanting to pay their respects by bringing tokens of affection, flowers, cards, messages, candles. We've seen that at all the royal residences, and of course Buckingham Palace has not been left out of all of that. My colleague Jane Hill is there for us now. Jane, I can see behind you a throng of people, thousands of people, there who are paying their respects, and it's been like that ever since the announcement was made that the Queen had passed away.
Thousands of people here now, Clive, for sure, outside Buckingham Palace. Considerably quieter very first thing this morning when we first started broadcasting, but now the crowds just keep growing and growing and growing. And I'm feeling lucky that I had a moment to go and look at many of those flowers, perhaps about 2 hours ago now, and thought, I'll look at a few and I'll come back later in the day and look at more. And it's going to be much, much harder to get anywhere near the flowers which are laying across the bottom of the railings. In fact, there's a polite sign that the palace has put there that says, any flowers left here will be kept for 12 hours and then they will be moved to an area of Green Park, which is, people may know, is the park just behind our camera position here. So there is going to be a carpet of flowers, I would imagine, by the time they are all moved into Green Park. And it's striking, but of course you say to people, why are you here? Why did you want to come? What brought you here? And it's just that sense of just wanted to be here, wanted to pay my respects. And when I stood at the railings a couple of hours ago, I was struck by how quiet it was, almost silent, beyond people standing, perhaps jostling for a better photo, everyone out with their phones taking photos of the flowers. But actually, an awful lot of people as well, Clive, just standing in quiet contemplation. I was struck by the people who'd come on their own, and they just stood very quietly, some of them even just looking at the ground or reading the messages on the cards. I've seen people in tears, I've seen people of all ages. I stopped a couple in Green Park who had just bought a bunch of flowers, were coming down, and I said, what drew you here? Can I ask you why you wanted to be here today? And the lady said to me, she said, well, I'm not even really from here. I've lived in London for years, but I'm originally from Taiwan. She was not my queen, as she said to me. But I had such respect for her. She said, I couldn't not be here this morning. I couldn't not buy these flowers and put them by the gate. And in particular, this lady highlighted the Queen's work ethic. She said, I was so struck by her work ethic. I couldn't believe she was still working right up until the end. I thought that was so admirable that only 2 days ago she saw the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, at Balmoral. And this lady was really struck by that and said, I just had to be here, and that's the reaction that you get. As you say, it is something that's been going on since late last night. There were thousands out here last night in the rain, weren't there?
Jane, I should, if I can just come in there, Jane, we've just had news that King Charles and the Queen Consort, they have now left Balmoral en route for Aberdeen Airport, and they are due to fly back to London in the next few minutes or so. And we know that when King Charles arrives, he will be having a meeting with Liz Truss, the Prime Minister. And we heard Jane there talking about some of those flowers, the hundreds of flowers and floral tributes that have been left by the railings of Buckingham Palace, how they're all going to be moved to nearby Green Park. Well, we are expecting that King Charles and the Queen Consort Camilla will be looking at some of those flowers by the railings of Buckingham Palace when they arrive, and reading some of the notes and getting more of a sense, if it was needed, of the kind of affection with which the Queen, in which the Queen was held. So Jane, thank you so much for that. Jane Hill, there, my colleague at Buckingham Palace. And King Charles III, as I say, and the Queen Consort have now left Balmoral. They're heading for Aberdeen Airport, and they will be on their way back to London in due course. Now, we've been hearing a lot about the international reaction to the Queen's passing, and we spoke to the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd here in the studio. We've been talking to my colleague, the Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, about Moscow's reaction and President Putin sending his own condolences to the royal family. Now we can get the perspective from France, closer to home. My colleague, the correspondent Hugh Schofield, is live in Paris for us now. Hugh, thanks for joining us. And I just wonder what the response has been. I mean, I can see a huge portrait of the Queen behind you. Just sum up what perhaps President Macron has been saying, the Élysée Palace and so on.
Yeah, well, I am outside the embassy and the ambassador's residence here on the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and the Élysée Palace is just 200 or 300 yards up the road, and we're expecting any minute now for President Macron to make his way down from the Élysée Palace, where you can't quite see, but the tricolour is at half-mast, down past the American embassy, where the ambassador's residence, where the American flag is at half-mast, to the British residence here. And there he's going to sign the book of condolence, we're told, and leave a single rose on the desk, which has been set up there with a portrait of the late Queen. He's issued a statement, he's recorded a message which is full of warmth and appreciation of the Queen, someone who he'd met a couple of times but didn't know that well, and much of what he's had to say in these statements refers to her long love and interest in France, an interest and a love which he says, and it's true, was reciprocated. France is a republic, people are proud Republicans, but there is in every French man and woman a little streak of royalism and a little streak of envy of the British for the institution of the monarchy. And that's very, very apparent. I've yet to meet a single person here in my 25 years here who wasn't interested in the Queen, fascinated by her, charmed by her. I just had a long conversation with my barber, for example, and his wife, who was telling me that yesterday when he heard the news, he couldn't understand why he felt this strange sensation. And it took him 5 minutes, he said, for him to sort of come to and realise what had happened, because for him and for French people and for people around the world, her presence was so permanent. She was a rock and a permanence not just for the British people, but for people around the world, and certainly for people in France who appreciated her francophilia. Remember, she came here first in 1948 as a young married wife with the Duke of Edinburgh, a visit which she looked back with incredible fondness afterwards, because it was after the misery of the war, and it was a springtime in Paris, and she was able to enjoy the opera and dinner at the Élysée and see Edith Piaf, and then went to this famous flower market on the Ile de la Cité, not far from here, which she loved, and she went back there in 2014 on her 5th and last state visit, and that was the occasion on which that flower market was renamed, and it's now called the Queen Elizabeth Flower Market.
OK. Hugh, thank you for that. Hugh Schofield there, a correspondent in Paris, outside the British Embassy there, where we know, as Hugh was saying, that President Macron will be leaving the Élysée Palace, which is just up the road from the British Embassy. He'll be heading to the residence of the British ambassador, and he'll be signing the Book of Condolence there. And interesting what Hugh was saying about the love and affection that the people of France had for the Queen as well. She was, of course, not only a constant in British life, but also globally as well. And we were getting just a little bit of a flavour of that from Hugh in Paris. Closer to home now, more reaction, political reaction. We're going to go to Westminster and talk to our chief political correspondent, Nick Earley, who's there. Nick, what are we? Just 35 minutes or so away from both houses of Parliament gathering so that MPs and peers can pay their own respects to the Queen.
Yes, Clive, that I think will be a lengthy session, a chance for politicians from across the political spectrum to pay their tributes. I should just say that the Cabinet met this morning in private to pay their own tributes to Queen Elizabeth this morning. I think it's a bit of a sense of history really here today. We've seen, quite a lot of change this week already, with the new Prime Minister being up at Balmoral to kiss hands with the Queen and become Prime Minister. We now have a new monarch who will be arriving back in London later. A real sense of the changing nature of British life, big changes in the constitutional makeup over the next few hours as well. It's worth pondering, I think, just how long Queen Elizabeth was a key person for Prime Ministers and for senior politicians to talk to. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister when she became Queen. She's had 15 Prime Ministers serve under her over the past 70 years. It really has been a period in which huge political change has taken place, and the message we've had from a lot of politicians who knew her well, who spent time with her, is they always found that quite a comfort, actually, knowing that the Queen had been there, had been that sense of continuity in British life, someone that they could speak to and rely on and take advice from about the burdens sometimes of high office. So I suspect we will hear a lot of that when senior politicians pay tribute to Her Majesty this afternoon. And then we will see later on today a quite remarkable moment where the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, someone who's only been Prime Minister, remember, for about 72 hours, will meet the new monarch, King Charles III, a man who has only been king for fewer than 24 hours. At the moment, they will have their first audience together, and there will be a big moment in British history there, the changing political leadership and the changing head of state in this country.
The Queen, of course, Nick, she kept her own counsel often. We had over the years judicious, tempered displays of her own views on certain issues. King Charles, of course, has been famously an activist prince and willing to get his own point of view out there on a number of issues: sustainable farming, the environment, climate change, and so on. One wonders if a activist prince transforming into a king, if that could affect the balance that we've had over the last 70 years in relation to Downing Street and the monarchy.
Well, there's no doubt that things will be different, Clive. You know, the Queen had spoken about her own views so little because she became the monarch at such a young age. King Charles, of course, was the first in line to the throne for decades and did speak a lot publicly about his views. The assumption here is that that will change over the coming hours. I think King Charles himself has said that his activism would stop the moment he became monarch. We know that he has some strong views about issues like the environment, but I wouldn't expect us to hear any of them over the next few months and the next few years. But you're right, you know, this is a moment where the relationship between the Crown and the Prime Minister and number 10 Downing Street will change in the sense that we get two new figures at the very top of British life, the very top of the British state. But the constitutional makeup in the UK and the fact that we have a constitutional monarchy where it's the Prime Minister who makes the decisions, even though they are officially signed off. They're given royal assent, of course, by the monarch. I don't think that there's any sense that that will change, that there are big changes coming to British life in terms of the figureheads who we see on a regular basis. The constitutional makeup will remain the same, though.
OK. Nick, thank you, our chief political correspondent there. In the main lobby there at Westminster, where we know in about half an hour both houses of Parliament will be gathering together so that the peers and MPs can pay their own respects to the departed monarch. And we've got pictures, I think, we can bring you now. This is of King Charles III leaving the Balmoral estate. He was at the Queen's bedside yesterday, of course, when she passed away. And now he is on his way. I think he's already at Aberdeenshire Airport for that flight to London. And he will also be meeting, of course, the Prime Minister, Liz Truss. They will be having talks. And then that address to the nation this evening, his first, of course, as king. The Queen was also head of the Commonwealth, of course, 56 countries right around the world. Let's talk now to Claire Whittaker, former chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Claire, thank you for being with us. The Queen held that Commonwealth together. There's no question about that. Her commitment to the institution was plain and clear. And that is something that the Commonwealth potentially is going to miss.
Yes, I mean, the Queen was enormously supportive of the Commonwealth. It was so much a priority for her. And in terms of the Royal Commonwealth Society, she was our patron. She was so supportive. She was very involved in our work. She hosted events for us. She asked for regular briefings. She visited us and the team in our offices. But I think that the importance of the Commonwealth within the royal family is really understood, and I know that now King Charles III will be wanting to make sure that her legacy and the importance that the Commonwealth meant to the Queen is maintained and sustained in the future.
Sure, I mean, it was a legacy of empire, no question about that, but it wasn't just the royal family trying to hang on to foreign dominions. The Queen firmly believed that nations talking to each other, discussing, negotiating, working together was important for global harmony, global peace. And that was an important part of what this was about, her relationship with the Commonwealth.
Well, I first got involved in the Commonwealth when I was actually working in South Africa with the ANC, when President Nelson Mandela took South Africa back into the Commonwealth. And the enthusiasm and excitement of that moment was why I got involved in the Commonwealth and began to see the importance of often nations that don't get the opportunity to be at a table, some of the small island states, the importance of that particular group of countries. So I came at the Commonwealth from a very different angle, but also the importance for young people in the Commonwealth and some of the opportunities that have been given to those young people. I mean, I was involved in the Queen's Young Leaders scheme for Commonwealth young leaders, and many young people got opportunities through that scheme that they would never have had otherwise. So I have seen firsthand how important the Commonwealth can be. Yes, it has a complicated past, but the Royal Commonwealth Society was very much about the future of the modern Commonwealth, the role of young people, opportunities to really convene and hear different voices around the table. And I think it was that role, that convening role, and of creating a different Commonwealth going forward, that's very important to all the people involved in the Commonwealth. And I know that the role of young people was particularly important to the Queen.
And particularly important to King Charles III as well. Do you see his commitment to the Commonwealth being as robust as the Queen's? The assumption is yes.
Well, so after I stopped working in South Africa, I then produced a concert for actually now King Charles, but then the Prince of Wales in Edinburgh for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And he stayed and met every single performer, every single Commonwealth nation was involved. And he was speaking then about the importance of the Commonwealth. And that was back in 1997. So I know, and I've done events with him in Australia around the Commonwealth. So I'm very sure that the Commonwealth will continue to be a priority because as well, he knows how important it was for the Queen and how important in this very uncertain and ever-changing world to have different voices around the table, to be able to consult and build alliances and to have that convening role. So I'm very much hoping that he will continue that legacy. I'm very confident that he will. I've seen his commitment in action.
I'm interested in the relationship that the people of the Commonwealth, and I'm a child of empire, my parents are Jamaican, I'm interested in what the people around the world who are part of the Commonwealth feel about the royal family and the Queen, because it is a vestige of empire, of dominion, of subjugation in some places. And I wonder why that affection, given what has happened over the last 24 hours, is so strong among so many of those countries.
Yes, and you have seen some Commonwealth countries re-evaluating their relationship to the Commonwealth and their relationship to the royal family. So I think, we can't forget that is part of the picture. Indeed. But I think that the Queen just rose above many of the history, the issues around the history of the Commonwealth, because of her duty, dedication, hard work, and the respect that she got from everybody, from heads of state to celebrities to members of the public. And that was not just restricted to the UK, but it was actually worldwide. And I think it was her sense of gravitas, of her wisdom and her experience. She'd been part of our lives for so long. And some of that was actually personal to her. It wasn't just about the Commonwealth. It was personal respect for her, for how she had conducted her life, for her sense of duty, the hard work. I mean, the fact that she was working, only earlier this week, it just shows how hard she had worked throughout her reign and the difference that she had made. And I think that respect was what most people responded to, and I think are responding to now at this very, very sad time.
OK, Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Claire Whitaker there, former chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society. We're going to pick up on some of those points in a couple of seconds, actually. With the noted historian Sir Simon Sharma. I should say that we understand that Prince Harry has landed back in London. That's the scene there at Heathrow. In fact, that's Aberdeen Airport, I understand. So that's actually him leaving the airport there. And I should say also, a number of events, of course, have been cancelled that are coming up over the weekend. The BBC's cancelled the last night of the proms as well. And we know that the Premier League have now decided to call off matches. Horse racing has been suspended as well for this weekend. And the English Football League, the EFL, have also cancelled this weekend's programme as a mark of respect to the Queen. And I think we've also got pictures, live pictures, coming into us from Paris. And this is the British Embassy there, just up the road, Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré, from the Élysée Palace, where President Macron has walked the short distance, and he's going to sign the Book of Condolence there. And as our correspondent Hugh Schofield was telling us a few minutes ago, leave a single white rose in memory of the Queen there, to mark his respects to her. Now, as I indicated, the historian, Sir Simon Sharma, is with me. It's good to see you. Thank you. You wanted to pick up on some of the words that we heard there from Claire Whitaker, former head of the Royal Commonwealth Society, and this idea that the Commonwealth, obviously a vestige of empire, yet there is a residual affection for the Queen.
And there was indeed, and still is. There's 54 countries, some of whom left the Commonwealth have come back to it. What was really remarkable, I think, about the Queen's attitude to the Commonwealth is that she understood what an imperial hangover was, really. She understood how it couldn't just be some casual euphemism for imperial nostalgia. And, you know, one dramatic example of that was the Queen went to Amritsar in India during her Indian trip, bowed her head at the Jallianwala Bagh, where the notorious Amritsar massacre, where British Indian soldiers fired into a crowd. Akin also to the extraordinary speech at Dublin Castle in 2011, when she said, we're all in some ways made by history, but we shouldn't be prisoners of it. She sort of registered that again a year later when she went to Belfast and said, so at that point she understood that history was also a matter of what you went through as a family, either a national family or an individual family. Her uncle had been murdered by the IRA. So those were things she didn't quite have to do. In fact, there was a moment in, I think it was 1983, the Christmas message, when she said, in effect, the Commonwealth is wonderful, but the great problem of the world is the gap between rich and poor countries, including in the Commonwealth. And she was accused by Enoch Powell of caring more about distant lands, as he put it, than her own people at home. So we always think about the Queen as being guarded, the essence of constitutional monarchy, which is, of course, absolutely crucial. But for someone who had been protected from formal schooling when she was young, she was immersed in the kind of history that really counted. She read, she thought, she understood, and she took chances.
You talk there about how she understood the role of empire had to evolve with all those countries that gained their independence. Do you think that transition from empire to the Commonwealth and to the institution that we know today was made only as smooth as it was because of the Queen?
She was incredibly important to that. I mean, you can't be a historian and not know that terrible things went on in Kenya, much of which you didn't know about because none of us knew about. I remember, old enough, Clive, to remember Aoka and the ferocious conflict in Cyprus in the 1950s. But she was, loving Africa, going to Africa such a lot so soon, really, after independence, was not an act. I mean, it was a role, but you can't, she said, I think at one point, I've been to more African countries countries than most Africans or something like that. But it was true.
Yeah.
And so she went from the woman in treetops who, on the Grand Safari, hearing of her father's death, to someone who was absolutely unembarrassed. There was a reason why Nelson Mandela was so fond of her. The Queen was known to be in favour of sanctions against apartheid South Africa, known. Whereas her Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, exactly.
Indeed.
That was the main source of...
There was a lot of tension between them.
A huge amount of tension.
Yeah.
So none of that, you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that from her upbringing or from her strict sense of constitutional neutrality. It was just part of who she was.
Indeed. King Charles III, one gets the impression that he doesn't believe that the Commonwealth is a casual euphemism for nostalgia, does he?
No, certainly not. And that comes from many of his long-standing passions, the fate of the earth, climate change. I mean, that's been his cause for, I've known him, 30 more years, really. And the fate of the earth is something which affects the distance between rich and poor. It's necessarily a global issue. And I suppose both the Queen and the King now have a very strong sense of what a nation is. It's a kind of community. And you have two choices, really. Is a nation as a community defined by foreigners, by all those who you are not? Or does your national identity, through the accidents of history, even the misfortunes and injustices of history, allow you to be a global thing? And you kind of know that King Charles is going to be on that side. How forward he's going to be to articulate, my hunch is he will be pretty forward, actually.
No, you see, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, an activist prince, monstrous carbuncles when it comes to architecture, of course, with the Duke of York's barracks in Chelsea. The environment, sustainability, and farming, climate change, and so on. As king, and you know him, is he going to be able to hold his tongue?
Intermittently. I think we, as I said from that Christmas message, we sometimes forget to parse those Christmas messages, which were full of issues of current importance. Take the pandemic, the Queen's wonderful Christmas speech. It was very subtly and emotionally done. So he does, I think, probably, there'll be advisors pressing in on the King, saying absolutely, don't change your convictions, good luck to him doing that. He's not going to do that. But we have to find a more negotiable language which does not put you in a position of sounding like a voting campaign. That, I'm sure, is possible.
I just wonder briefly, if you were writing a speech tonight, what would you expect him to say? What would you want him to say to unite a country that is going through the grief for many millions of people of the death of the only Queen they've ever known?
Well, far be it from me. However, he will, I'm sure, saying something about continuity, about how the Queen embodied in her person a kind of mysterious magic in which past, present and future were somehow bundled up together, and that will go on. That's what, it is a mysterious and magical thing, really. I think, all nations right now, oddly enough, in the time of digital, cyber, everything, want anchorage. They want to be part of a family, really, and an inclusive family as well, a family which acknowledges everything that's changed in Britain since his mother became Queen in 1952. And that will go on. And I don't know, knowing him, he won't be short of inspiration or the language.
Indeed. Sir Simon Sharma, pleasure to have you in. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. More news of another event cancelled following the death of the Queen. The TUC Congress was due to be held in Brighton this coming Sunday. It's been postponed. We know the Premier League matches and the English Football League matches, EFL matches, they've all been cancelled as well. Horse racing has been cancelled too. We know that the RMT has called off its latest series of strikes. All this, of course, in response to the death of the Queen. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has paid tribute to Her Majesty. He's been talking to our religion editor, Ali McBourne.
I think part of her great service that was unseen was that, as one former Prime Minister I heard saying at one point in a conversation, that there was only one person in the world that he could talk to and say exactly what he thought and felt, and was 100% certain that it would never go any further. And that was Her Majesty. I'm also absolutely sure that it will be equally true for His Majesty, by the way. And I think that that was a hidden service. She was a place of confidences and of accumulated wisdom. I talked to her last in July, I think at the beginning of July, late June. And we were talking about a particular individual. And she said, oh, it rather reminds me of, and talked about a world leader she'd met in the 1960s. And it was a perfect comparison. There was that deep sense of wisdom which was given in service of the country. But there was also just the service of her time. Hundreds of events every year which she attended. And she was the one, and again, it runs in the family. I've seen His Majesty do the same thing, who could go into a room full of people or walk down a crowded street, and everyone she spoke to felt that they were the only person there. She was never looking over their shoulders to see, is there someone a bit more interesting to see? Everybody got her attention.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby there, with his reflections on the Queen. Well, our Scotland correspondent, Alexandra MacKenzie, is at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood for us. We heard the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, yesterday, Alexandra, pay her condolences and put on record her admiration for the Queen. Have there been any other tributes from the politicians there?
Well, Clive, we're just outside the Palace of Holyrood House, which is very close to the Scottish Parliament at the bottom of the Royal Mile. And this is the official residence for the royal family when they are in Scotland. They tend to come here at the end of June, beginning of July, just for a few days before they go up for a more relaxing holiday up at Balmoral. And even though there are no members of the royal family here at the moment, people have been using this as a focus point, somewhere to come, somewhere to pay their respects, somewhere to remember. A lot of people have been coming up to us and telling us why they're here and becoming quite emotional. I was here last night and people started arriving, straight after the announcement was made, and there is an official announcement here on the gate, as there is also at Buckingham Palace, and there's a steady queue of people, and there has been since last night, people coming here to take a look at that. Also, many people coming to lay flowers. There's piles of flowers. I'm not sure if you can see it through the crowd of people, but again, that's been building up since last night. It's been very organised here. Staff from within the palace have been directing people away from the gates so as not to block the outside of the gates with flowers, but instead to put it on the grass here so people can stand. There's a real stillness, people just standing, contemplating and watching what's happening. Some people taking photographs, a kind of solemn stillness here, considering the amount of people that are coming through. And I've got two guests with me. Carolyn, I'll come to you first. Now, you're from Florida and you just flew into Edinburgh this morning, and you came straight here to Holyrood. What was your reaction when you heard of the Queen's death?
Well, we were very shocked. We were in the Orlando airport yesterday when we heard the news, and all I can say is shock. I think many Americans like me had a lot of respect for the Queen, a lot of admiration for the amount of years and the job that she did. So when I got here and realized how close I was to walk over here, we haven't even checked into our hotel yet.
Okay,
came here.
And one very quick question to you. You're local from Leith, Linda, if you can, but I know it was very important for you to come here.
I wanted to come down and lay some flowers for the Queen because I feel she's been such a wonderful servant for the country, and Scotland's mourning her today. Very sad.
Okay, that's great. Thank you both very much, Carolyn and Linda. And we are expecting the gun salute at 1 o'clock at the other end of the Royal Mile up at Edinburgh Castle.
Alexandra, thank you. Alexandra MacKenzie there, our correspondent at the Palace of Holyrood. My colleague Laura Koonsberg is here with me. We're just counting down, Laura, to the top of the hour, and the bells that are going to be ringing out from Westminster Abbey, St Paul's Cathedral, churches right across the country, Windsor Castle as well, of course. A very public declaration of the fact that a new king is in place, and he's going to be taking up the role on his first full day when he arrives back in London, hopefully, in the next few minutes.
That's right. And one of the other things that he'll be doing today is having his first audience with the new Prime Minister. That vital meeting, that vital relationship that will likely become of such importance to the new monarch, and a continuation, of course, of the relationship that his mother, the Queen, had for many decades with very many Prime Ministers, going back from the 1950s all the way up until the modern day, through so many social changes, through so much political upheaval, and that relationship being something of stability. Whatever the turbulence in the country, whatever the political agonies, whatever the disputes and the debates and all of the arguments, particularly in recent years, the occupant of the throne really being that central point while everything else swirled around, something, of course, that the Buckingham Palace will seek to continue with King Charles III.
Indeed, that message of continuity. We were just talking to Sir Simon Sharma, who's met the Queen and knew the Queen and knows Prince Charles, now King Charles, very well. He made the point that that speech tonight, his first address to the nation, is likely to focus on that sense of continuity and stability that we know the Queen gave to this country and the Commonwealth over 70 years.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of the things that only a handful of people in the country would ever have had a real insight into what that behind-the-scenes relationship was like between the politicians of the day and the Queen herself. But there's no question that it was a relationship of the absolute utmost importance. You know, a trusted advisor, a consigliere, somebody who could encourage and perhaps warn, and also the Queen with an unrivaled sort of memory, actually, of the wiring of government, how things work in this country. She was always famous for spending hours, a couple of hours every day, going through her red boxes, reading government papers, reading the cabinet minutes every single week. And that will also be one of the tasks that King Charles takes on himself, to have that knowledge and that understanding of the dilemmas and opportunities that face our political leaders from that very particular point of view of continuity, stability, and also being able to be a trusted advisor, where, you know, in politics there's often so much mistrust, but that relationship between 10 Downing Street and the Palace is such an important connection, a sort of special thread that is one of the parts of that helps this country hang together.
Briefly, Laura, would there have been much of a relationship between Prince Charles and Liz Truss, now King Charles III and Prime Minister? I mean, the meeting that they're going to have today, is that pretty much a getting to know you session?
Well, I think Liz Truss has actually been around in the cabinet for a long time, so it's not as if she's some sort of new political leader who's just emerged into the public domain. Certainly she's only very recently become Prime Minister, but she's held a variety of senior posts over a long period of time, and will therefore from time to time have come into contact with King Charles. That said, I don't think there's anything quite like that relationship between monarch and Prime Minister. It's had its tension over the years, certainly, but that is a very, very prized relationship that, you know, occasionally former Prime Ministers have spoken about it, but by and large it's something extremely private, but also the monarch is expected also to keep them on their toes. One former Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, always said when you went to see the Queen, she expected you to have done your homework. And that sense of them having to be up to snuff was something very important.
Indeed, indeed. We're counting down to the bells that will be tolled in churches and cathedrals across this united kingdom. These islands that will sound out the fact that the dawn of a new monarchy begins with King Charles III. And this, the picture at Westminster Abbey, where those bells will toll in the next couple of seconds.
Is that us? You got it?
Right across these islands then, from high place to low, town, city, village, church bells ringing out, proclaiming the death of the Queen, but also signalling the reign of King Charles III, now of course head of the Church of England. And we can go to the Commons for a moment of silence in the chamber there. Both houses meeting today so that peers and MPs can pay their own tributes to the Queen. And we know that King Charles III will be speaking to Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, on his arrival.
Before I call the Prime Minister, it is with the greatest sadness that I rise to say a few words in tribute to Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth. Almost all of us in the House have experienced no other monarch this country's throne but Her late Majesty. There are indeed only a score or so members in this House who have already been born, let alone who can recall a time when she wasn't the Queen. She is wedded in our minds with the crown and all it stands for. After accession in February 1952, she first came to the Palace of Westminster to open the session of Parliament in November 1952, when Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister and Speaker William Morrison was in the chair, almost 70 years ago. 57 complete sessions of Parliament have passed since then, and as she was here to open all but 3 of them, as parliamentarians, we have celebrated with her for silver, golden, diamond jubilees, and of course marked her platinum jubilee this year, in which the lamp standards have been unveiled in New Palace Yard. In this place, her reign saw 10 different speakers occupy the chair. During her reign, there were 18 general elections, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will remind of us how many of her predecessors she welcomed to, and always, I am sure, with quiet wisdom. As the longest-serving monarch this country has known, she would have been assured of a notable entry in our history books, even were it not for the magnificence in which she undertook the role as Queen, but for a magnificent service, and what a service that entailed, not just as head of the nation, but head of the Commonwealth, head of the Armed Forces, and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Over her reign, she has seen unprecedented social, cultural, technological change. Through it all, she was the most conscientious and dutiful of monarchs. But while she understood the inescapable nature of duty, which sometimes must have weighed upon her heavily, she also delighted in carrying it out, for she was the most devoted monarch. As well as Queen, she was a wife, a mother, a grandmother and great-grandmother, roles she carried out with the same sense of vocation as well as human kindness as the role of Queen. Her life, without unhappiness and troubles, but our memories of her will be filled with that image of a gently smiling dedication that showed throughout her life. Indeed, while this is a time of very considerable sadness, those memories of a noble, gracious lady who devoted her life to her family, the United Kingdom, and those nations around the world whom she served as Queen, will bring us some consolation and joy. My deepest sympathies are with His Majesty, the King, and other members of the royal family, to whom I commend all our sincere condolences and support at this very, very sad time. Order. We are meeting today for tributes to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth. I would like to inform the House that we will sit today until approximately 10 p.m. for tributes. At approximately 6 o'clock, the House will be suspended while His Majesty, the King, makes his broadcast to the nation. Members present will be able to watch the broadcast on screens in the chamber. We will then resume our proceedings to continue with tributes. The House will then sit again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. The first business will be oath-taking for a small number of senior members. Members to be invited to take the oath tomorrow are being contacted by my office. All other members will have an opportunity to take the oath when the House returns. After oath-taking tomorrow, tributes will be continued. The House is expected to sit till approximately 10 p.m. The House is not expected to sit on Sunday. I now call the Prime Minister, Elizabeth Truss.
Mr. Speaker, in the hours since last night's shocking news, we have witnessed the most heartfelt outpouring of grief at the loss of Her late Majesty, the Queen. Crowds have gathered, flags have been lowered to half-mast, tributes have been sent from every continent around the world. On the death of her father, King George VI, Winston Churchill said the news had stilled the clatter and traffic of 20th century life in many lands. Now, 70 years later, in the tumult of the 21st century, life has paused again. Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, was one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. She was the rock on which modern Britain was built. She came to the throne at just 25, in a country that was emerging from the shadow of war. She bequeaths a modern, dynamic nation that has grown and flourished under her reign. The United Kingdom is the great country it is today because of her. The Commonwealth is the family of nations it is today because of her. She was devoted to the union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. She served 15 countries as head of state, and she loved them all. Her words of wisdom gave us strength in the most testing times. During the darkest moments of the pandemic, she gave us hope that we would meet again. She knew this generation of Britons would be as strong as any. And as we meet today, we remember the pledge she made on her 21st birthday to dedicate her life to service. The whole House will agree. Never has a promise been so completely fulfilled. Yeah. Her devotion to duty remains an example to us all. She carried out thousands of engagements. She took a red box every day. She gave her assent to countless pieces of legislation and was at the heart of our national life for 7 decades. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she drew on her deep faith. She was the nation's greatest diplomat. Her visits to post-apartheid South Africa and to the Republic of Ireland showed a unique ability to transcend difference and heal division. In total, she visited well over 100 countries. She met more people than any other monarch in our history. She gave counsel to prime ministers and ministers across government. I have personally greatly valued her wise advice. Only last October, I witnessed firsthand how she charmed the world's leading investors at Windsor Castle. She was always so proud of Britain and always embodied the spirit of our great country. She remained determined to carry out her duties, even at the age of 96. It was just 3 days ago at Balmoral that she invited me.
We're breaking away from the Commons to show you pictures at Aberdeen Airport, and this is King Charles III, and we think the Queen Consort Camilla as well. They are preparing to make their journey back to London, and there as the king. He will, of course, have in his mind an idea of what he will be saying to the nation on this, the first full day of his reign. And as he thanks those members of the royal staff who have helped him and guided him and the rest of the royal family through the last few hours. Camilla, I think there, under the umbrella, he will have, I'm sure, a sense of what he wants to say to the nation tonight. We were talking to the historian Sir Simon Sharma a little bit earlier on. He knew the Queen and he's known Prince Charles for 30-some years. And he suggested that perhaps one key part of the address tonight to the nation will be that sense of continuity, that the legacy of his mother, the Queen, now departed, will continue in terms of the strength and grit and fortitude that she showed in her rule, and he will endeavour to continue that legacy. There they are, just having boarded that plane, their RAF flight, heading back to London, where he will be meeting Liz Truss, who is still on her feet, I see, in the Commons, making her remarks in remembrance of the Queen. Let's go back to the chamber.
I was grateful to speak to His Majesty last night and offer my condolences. Even as he mourns, his sense of duty and service is clear. He has already made a profound contribution through his work on conservation, education, and his tireless diplomacy. We owe him our loyalty and devotion. The British people, the Commonwealth, and all of us in this House will support him as he takes our country forward to a new era of hope and progress, our new Carolean age. The crown endures, our nation endures, and in that spirit, I say, God save the King.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, our country, our people, this House, are united in mourning. Queen Elizabeth II was this great country's greatest monarch, and for the vast majority of us, it feels impossible to imagine a Britain without her. All our thoughts are with her beloved family, our royal family, at this moment of profound grief. This is a deep and private loss for them, yet it's one we all share, because Queen Elizabeth created a special personal relationship with us all. That relationship was built on the attributes that defined her reign: her total commitment to service and duty, her deep devotion to the country, the Commonwealth, and the people she loved. In return for that, we loved her. And it is because of that great shared love that we grieve today. For the 70 glorious years of her reign, our Queen was at the heart of this nation's life. She did not simply reign over us. She lived alongside us. She shared in our hopes and our fears, our joy and our pain, our good times and our bad. Our Queen played a crucial role as the thread between the history we cherish and the present we own. A reminder that our generational battle against the evil of fascism or the emergence of a new Britain out of the rubble of the Second World War do not only belong to the past, but are the inheritance of each and every one of us. A reminder that the creativity, the hard work, the enterprise that has always defined this nation is as abundant now as it ever was. A reminder that the prospect of a better future still burns brightly. Never was this link more important, that when our country was plunged into lockdown at the start of the pandemic, her simple message that we would see family again, that we would see friends again, that we would be together again, gave people strength and courage when they needed it most. But it wasn't simply the message that allowed a shaken nation to draw upon those reserves. It was the fact that she was the messenger. COVID closed the front doors of every home in the country. It made our lives smaller and more remote. But she was able to reach beyond that, to reassure us and steel us. At the time we were most alone, at a time we'd been driven apart, she held the nation close in a way no one else could have done. For that, we say thank you. On the occasion of the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, Philip Larkin wrote of her reign, "In times when nothing stood, but worsened or grew strange, there was one constant good: she did not change." It feels like we are once again in a moment in our history where, as Larkin put it, things are growing strange, where everything is spinning. A nation requires a still point. When times are difficult, it requires comfort. And when direction is hard to find, it requires leadership. The loss of our Queen robs this country of its stillest point, its greatest comfort, at precisely the time we need those things most. But our Queen's commitment to us, her life of public service, was underpinned by one crucial understanding: that the country she came to symbolise is bigger than any one individual or any one institution. It is the sum total of all our history and all our endeavours, and it will endure. The late Queen would have wanted us to redouble our efforts, to turn our collar up and face the storm, to carry on. Most of all, she would want us to remember that it is in these moments that we must pull together. This House is a place where ideas and ideals are debated. Of course, that leads to passionate disagreement. Of course, temperatures can run high. But we all do it in pursuit of something greater. We do it because we believe we can make this great country and its people greater still. At this moment of uncertainty, where our country feels caught between a past it cannot relive and a future yet to be revealed, we must always remember one of the great lessons of our Queen's reign: that we are always better when we rise above the petty, the trivial, the day-to-day, to focus on the things that really matter, the things that unite us, rather than those which divide us. Our Elizabethan age may now be over, but her legacy will live on forever. And as the children of that era, it falls upon us to take that legacy forward, to show the same love of country, the love of one another, as she did, to show empathy and compassion as she did, and to get Britain through this dark night and bring it into the dawn as she did. We join together today not just to say goodbye to our Queen, to share in our mourning, but to say something else important. God save the King, because as one era ends, so another begins. King Charles III has been a devoted servant of this country his entire life. He has been a powerful voice for fairness and understood the importance of the environment long before many others. As he ascends to his new role, with the Queen Consort by his side, the whole House, indeed the whole country, will join today to wish him a long, happy and successful reign. Mr. Speaker, the emotions we see across the nation today are echoed across the Commonwealth to which our Queen was so committed, in the church to which our Queen was so devoted, and in the armed forces which she led and her family served. Around the world, people will be united in mourning for her passing and united in celebrating her life. We've already seen beautiful tributes flow from across the world. It will be impossible to capture them all here. But each one is a reminder of the esteem in which she was held, of what she achieved on behalf of her country, of the shared values we treasure. The reason our loss feels so profound is not just because she stood at the head of our country for 70 years, but because, in spirit, she stood amongst us. As we move forward, as we forge a new path, as we build towards a better future, she will always be with us. For all she gave us and all she will continue to give us, we say thank you. May our Queen rest in peace. God save the King.
I now call on the Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Constituents will wish me briefly to record their love, respect and gratitude to Her late Majesty. We can give continuing life to her values and virtues of kindness, aspiration, perseverance and pride. We thank her. We miss her.
As we hear the voice there of Peter Bottomley, longest-serving member of the Commons, Father of the House, we see the pictures there of that executive RAF jet at Aberdeenshire Airport with, of course, on board the King and Queen Consort as they fly into a new future for them, the country and the Commonwealth. Just taxiing on the runway there. Peter Bottomley there making his views known about his affection for the Queen. We know Ian Blackford is now on his feet. And a little earlier we heard Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the Commons, open the session with the Prime Minister Liz Truss and the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, giving their words there. When he was the Prince, just yesterday, he was at the bedside of the Queen when she passed away, and automatically, of course, he became King Charles III, but there are constitutional I's to dot and T's to cross, and we know that there will be a meeting of the Accession Council tomorrow at 10 o'clock, usually held within 24 hours, to formally proclaim the new monarch. And that council, it's made up of representatives from the Lords, the Lord Mayor of London, the Aldermen of the City of London, some Commonwealth High Commissioners, indeed, and all the members of the Privy Council. It is purely a ceremonial body, and their proclamation has no legal standing, as I say, as Charles has automatically become king. But it is one of those constitutional arrangements that must be followed and should be followed as we embark on the era of Charles III. That plane due to take off in the next few seconds or so as the pilot steadies the craft. The weather a little bit better than yesterday. It was lashing it down in Balmoral and lashing it down as well outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor, and yet thousands of people were turning up at all those royal residences to pay their respects. And we know from talking to my colleagues outside Buckingham Palace that people were turning up in the middle of the night to lay flowers and candles and cards. And of course all those flowers outside Buckingham Palace, they've got to go somewhere. So we understand that around 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I think, many of them will be moved to to nearby Green Park, where members of the public can also see some of the messages that have been left by their fellow countrymen and women in remembrance of the Queen. And we are expecting, of course, Prince Charles to look at some of those cards and flowers on his own walkabout, perhaps with the Queen Consort. And there it is, that RAF jet about to take off, making its way back to London, with King Charles III and the Queen Consort flying off into a new era for this country and for them as leaders of these islands. And we are expecting, as we heard from Sir Lindsay Hoyle there in the Commons, the suspension of Parliament at around about 6 o'clock. And he indicated that it might be around about that time when we could well hear the address, that national address for the first time of King Charles III, where we expect him to emphasize that his reign will be a symbol of continuity after the death of his mother. I think we're going to go back to the Commons now, where MPs have been making speeches showing their respect for the Queen, and there's Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP.
Aspirations for a modern Scotland, the values that so often embodied by Her Majesty herself. And in what was sadly her final ever address to the Scottish Parliament, her love of Scotland and its people was clear, when she said, "It is the people that make a place, and there are few places where this is truer than it is in Scotland." The relationship between Scotland and the Queen was one of shared admiration. Indeed, whilst she was everyone's Queen, for many in Scotland, she was Elizabeth, Queen of Scots. Her Majesty's roots in Scotland run deep. She was descended from the Royal House of Stuart on both sides, and her family, of course, her mother, was from Glamis and Angus. It is clear that these family ties gave way to a great and enduring affection, and Scotland was a place that was truly held dear to her, not only in an official capacity, but in a private capacity as well. It is well known that Balmoral, with its beautiful and atmospheric scenery, was the Queen's favourite home. Balmoral was a place where she was able to enjoy freedom, peace and the ability to indulge her love of the great outdoors, whether that was walking with her dogs, riding with horses, hosting picnics and barbecues, or from behind the wheel of her Land Rover. It is clear that Balmoral has been a place of peace and sanctuary for her throughout her whole life, and perhaps particularly so following the death of her husband, life companion and love, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. It is therefore perhaps fitting that she has met her final peace at Balmoral, a place where she found such enjoyment and comfort. And as someone of demonstrably strong faith, she will now have enduring peace with herself and, of course, to be reunited with Prince Philip. Her Majesty was a life of grace and wisdom, defined by its service to the public and by the lives that she touched. Her legacy and her enduring presence will live on. God bless the Queen. May she rest in peace. God bless the King.
Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the House will not mind if I begin with a personal confession. A few months ago, the BBC came to see me to talk about Her Majesty the Queen, and we sat down and the cameras started rolling, and they requested that I should talk about her in the past tense. And I'm afraid I simply choked up and I couldn't go on. I'm really not easily moved to tears, but I was so overcome with sadness that I had to ask them to go away. And I know that today there are countless people in this country and around the world who have experienced the same sudden access of unexpected emotion. And I think millions of us are trying to understand why we are feeling this deep and personal and almost familial sense of loss. Perhaps it's partly that she's always been there, a changeless human reference point in British life, the person who, all the surveys say, appears most often in our dreams, so unvarying in her pole star radiance that we have perhaps been lulled into thinking that she might be in some way eternal. But I think our shock is keener today because we are coming to understand in her death the full magnitude of what she did for us all. And think of what we asked that 25-year-old woman all those years ago. To be the person so globally trusted that her image should be on every unit of our currency, every postage stamp, the person in whose name all justice is dispensed in this country, every law passed, to whom every minister of the Crown swears allegiance, and for whom every member of our armed services is pledged, if necessary, to lay down their lives. Think what we asked of her in that moment. Not just to be the living embodiment in her DNA of the history and continuity and unity of this country, but to be the figurehead of our entire system, the keystone in the vast arch of the British state, a role that only she could fulfill because in the brilliant and durable bargain of the constitutional monarchy, only she could be trusted to be above any party political or commercial interest and to incarnate impartially the very concept and essence of the nation. Think what we asked of her and think what she gave. She showed the world not just how to reign over a people, she showed the world how to give, how to love, and how to serve. And as we look back at that vast arc of service, its sheer duration is almost impossible to take in. She was the last living person in British public life to have served in uniform in the Second World War. She was the first female member of the royal family in 1,000 years to serve full-time in the armed forces, and that impulse to do her duty carried her right through into her 10th decade to the very moment in Balmoral, as my right honourable friend has said, only 3 days ago, when she saw off her 14th Prime Minister and welcomed her 15th. And I can tell you, in that audience, she was as radiant and as knowledgeable and as fascinated by politics as ever I can remember, and as wise in her advice as anyone I know, if not wiser. And over that extraordinary span of public service, with her naturally retentive and inquiring mind, I think, and doubtless many of the 15 would agree, that she became the greatest statesman and diplomat of all. And she knew instinctively how to cheer up the nation, how to lead a celebration. I remember her innocent joy more than 10 years ago after the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when I told her that the leader of a friendly Middle Eastern country seemed actually to believe that she had jumped out of a helicopter in a pink dress and parachuted into the stadium. And I remember her equal pleasure on being told just a few weeks ago that she had been a smash hit in her performance with Paddington Bear. And perhaps more importantly, she knew how to keep us going when times were toughest. In 1940, when this country and this democracy faced the real possibility of extinction, she gave a broadcast, aged only 14, that was intended to reassure the children of Britain. She said then, "We know, every one of us, that in the end, all will be well." She was right. And she was right again in the darkest days of the COVID pandemic, when she came on our screens and told us that we would meet again. And we did. And I know I speak for other Prime Ministers, when I say ex-Prime Ministers, when I say that she helped to comfort and guide us, as well as the nation, because she had the patience and the sense of history to see that troubles come and go, and that disasters are seldom as bad as they seem. And it was that indomitability, that humour, that work ethic, and that sense of history, which together made her Elizabeth the Great. And when I call her that, I should add one, Elizabeth the Great, I should add one final quality, of course, which was her humility. Her single-bar electric fire Tupperware using refusal to be grand. And unlike us politicians, with our outriders and our armour-plated convoys, I can tell you, as a direct eyewitness, that she drove herself in her own car with no detectives and no bodyguard, bouncing at alarming speed over the Scottish landscape to the total amazement of the ramblers and the tourists we encountered. And it is that indomitable spirit with which she created the modern constitutional monarchy. An institution so strong and so happy and so well understood, not just in this country, but in the Commonwealth and around the world, that the succession has already seamlessly taken place. And I believe she would regard it as her own highest achievement, that her son, Charles III, will clearly and amply follow her own extraordinary standards of duty and service. Yeah. And the fact that today we can say with such confidence, "God save the King," is a tribute to him, but above all to Elizabeth the Great, who worked so hard for the good of her country, not just now, but for generations to come. That is why we mourn her so deeply. And it is in the depths of our grief that we understand why we loved her so much.
We now come to Mother of the House, Harriet Ham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and what an excellent speech from the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, which I'm sure will have resonated in every member of this House and indeed everyone in this country. It was a brilliant speech. I'm grateful for the opportunity to pay my tribute to the Queen and to do so on my own behalf, but also on behalf of my constituents, particularly those who, coming from Commonwealth countries in Africa and the Caribbean, held the Queen in such high regard. We're a constitutional monarchy, and for we MPs, the Queen was ever present in the interwoven relationship between the monarch and her Parliament. She underpinned our democratic system for over 70 years, underpinning it but never intervening in it. She was always salient but never meddled. She avoided controversy not by staying in the background, far from it. She performed her role to the utmost, but she did it by respecting the boundaries. She carried out her duties and gave us her full commitment for us to carry out ours. When many denigrated, she always respected and supported Parliament, and we should be very grateful for that. Between her ministers, and not just Prime Ministers, there was regular contact. After Labour won the election in 1997, I went up to the Palace where, like the other new Secretaries of State, she appointed me to the Privy Council and bestowed on me the seals of office. They are actual seals which are given to you and you take back to your department to be locked in a safe. But when just a year later I was sacked, and the seals taken out of the safe and taken back to Buckingham Palace, my diary was empty and my phone stopped ringing. my office was astonished to get a call from Buckingham Palace. No one else wanted to have anything to do with me, but the Queen wanted to see me. I was invited to take tea with the Queen for her to thank me for my service as Secretary of State. My point is that the relationship between our Queen and Parliament and our Queen and government was never just on paper, but was always active and always encouraging. She radiated British values of duty, patriotism, internationalism, charity and service. But while she embodied British values, she never intervened in politics. And that is constitutional alchemy, nothing less. It's evident that everyone, even those who don't agree with the hereditary principle of the monarchy, cannot but marvel at her personal qualities. And I want to marvel at how she could do all this flawlessly, not just over so many decades, but as a woman starting her reign in what was emphatically then a man's world. Yeah. We have to remember what attitudes were at the time. The order of the day was men were in charge and women were subservient. The man was head of the household, and the role of a woman was to get married, have his children, and support him. In the 1950s, when she was crowned, I was a child, and I remember my mother warning me that people thought men knew more than women, that men's views were valuable, whilst women's were to be disregarded. And so it was in that atmosphere that she stepped up as a 25-year-old married woman with 2 children to take her place at the head of this nation and play a huge role on the world stage. What determination and courage that must have taken. Yeah. The prime ministers she dealt with were mostly men, mostly twice her age. Things were very different. A huge change has taken place during her reign. Things were very different when 6 years ago she threw open Buckingham Palace for us to celebrate the 70th anniversary of BBC's Woman's Hour, to celebrate how much women had achieved. As Sir Tony Blair said, she was the matriarch of this nation, a matriarch for us on the world stage, and a matriarch too at home in her own family. As well as being our monarch, she was the mother of 4 children, had many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and it is to her family that I extend my deepest sympathies for their loss and condolences for their grief, which we all share.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great sadness that I rise to pay tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, on my behalf and on behalf of my Maidenhead constituents. Yesterday was a day that we all knew would come sometime, but in our hearts of hearts, we hoped never would. But as we mourn a beloved monarch, we must always remember that she was a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother, and my thoughts and prayers are with King Charles III and the whole of the royal family. Yeah. And I also remember the close members of her royal household. Queen Elizabeth II was quite simply the most remarkable person I have ever met. I am sometimes asked, among all the world leaders I met, who was the most impressive? And I have no hesitation in saying that from all the heads of state and government, the most impressive person I met was Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She gave a lifetime of service as she promised to do when she was 21. Her selfless devotion to duty was an inspiration and example to us all. She was respected and loved, not just here in the United Kingdom and in her other realms and the Commonwealth, but across the world. And that love, respect, and admiration was born not out of her position, but because of the person she was. a woman of dignity and grace, of compassion and warmth, of mischief and joy, of wisdom and experience, and of a deep understanding of her people. Like so many until last evening, I had never known another monarch. She was a constant throughout our lives, always there for us, uniting us at times of difficulty, and as others have said, most recently during COVID, when she gave us hope that we would once more come together. Her passing marks a generational change, not just because of the length of her service, but because of what she lived through. When we marked the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings in 2019, she was with the world leaders not just as Queen, but as someone who had worn uniform during the Second World War, an experience which, quite apart from anything else, had taught her how to strip an engine. The Queen was always interested in people. When she walked into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up. Into a room, the faces of those present were lit up, including on what was one of her last, if not the last, appearance she made in public, when she came to open Thames Hospice in my Maidenhead constituency in July. The moment she walked through the door, the atmosphere in the room changed. You felt the love and respect of the people there for her. And as she spoke to staff and patients, she exuded a warmth and humanity which put people at their ease. She was Queen, but she embodied us. Across the nations of the world and for so many people, meeting Queen Elizabeth simply made their day, and for many will be the memory of their life. Of course, for those of us who had the honour to serve as one of her Prime Ministers, those meetings were more frequent with the weekly audiences. These were not meetings with a high and mighty monarch, but a conversation with a woman of experience and knowledge and immense wisdom. They were also the one meeting I went to, which I knew would not be briefed out to the media. What made those audiences so special was the understanding the Queen had of issues which came from the work she put into her red boxes, combined with her years of experience. She knew many of the world leaders. In some cases, she had known their fathers. And she was a wise and adroit judge of people. The conversations at the audiences were special, but so were weekends at Balmoral, where the Queen wanted all her guests to enjoy themselves. And she was a thoughtful hostess. She would take an interest in what books were put in your room, and she didn't always expect to be the centre of attention. She was quite happy sometimes to sit playing her form of patience while others were mingling around her, chatting to each other. My husband tells of the time he had a dream. He dreamt that he was sitting in the back of a Range Rover being driven around a Balmoral estate, and the driver was Her Majesty the Queen, and the passenger's seat was occupied by his wife, the Prime Minister. And then he woke up and realised it was reality. Her Majesty loved the countryside, and she was down to earth and a woman of common sense. I remember one picnic at Balmoral which was taking place in one of the bothes on the estate. The hampers came from the castle and we all mucked in to put the food and drink out on the table. I picked up some cheese, put it on a plate and was transferring it to the table. The cheese fell on the floor. I had a split-second decision to make. I picked up the cheese, put it on the plate and put it on the table. And I turned round to see that my every move had been watched very carefully by Her Majesty the Queen. I looked at her, she looked at me, and she just smiled. And the cheese remained on the table. This is indeed a sad day, but it is also a day of celebration of a life well spent in the service of others. There have been many words of tribute and superlatives used to describe Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but these are not hype. They are entirely justified. She was our longest-serving monarch. She was respected around the world. She united our nation in times of trouble. She joined in our celebrations with joy and a mischievous smile. She gave an example to us all of faith, of service, of duty, of dignity, of decency. She was remarkable, and I doubt we will ever see her like again. May she rest in peace and rise in glory.
Sir Ed Davey.
It's a real pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady, and can I congratulate her on her lovely, heartwarming speech. Mr. Speaker, Liberal Democrats join members from all sides of the House in expressing our deepest condolences on the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. We are mourning a profound loss. The Queen was a formidable monarch who faithfully served our country for all her life and was loved the world over. She represented not only duty and courage, but warmth and compassion, and she was a living reminder of our collective past, of the greatest generation and their sacrifices for our freedom. For many people, myself included, Her Majesty was an ever-fixed mark in our lives. As the world changed around us and politicians came and went, she was our nation's constant. In challenging times, she was always a source of calm and comfort. And she tied our nations together, embodying an unwavering pride in our country, showing us that patriotism is not defined by political allegiance, and reminding us of the many things that bind us all together, even when it doesn't always feel that way. We saw this so vividly during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June. I'm proud to represent the oldest royal borough in England, Kingston upon Thames. And our Jubilee Street parties certainly lived up to that status. It was truly wonderful to see such an outpouring of affection from people across Kingston from all walks of life. School children who baked Jubilee cakes, neighbours who shared bunting, choirs who sang hymns of praise. And it was incredibly fitting, wasn't it? That after so long kept apart by COVID, it was the Queen and the celebration of Her Majesty's reign that brought our communities back together so joyfully. Just as the whole country is united today, so sadly, in grief. The deep mourning across the country now, just like the celebrations of her Jubilee a few months ago, comes not from a sense of duty, but from genuine and heartfelt affection, love, and admiration of Her Majesty. It was not because we were her subjects, but because she was truly our Queen. What she meant to us is perhaps best summed up by a phrase on so many people's lips over the last 24 hours. I can't imagine our country without her. For almost everyone in our country, she has been there our whole lives. Times of national grief and national jubilation, she has never not been there for us. So it's hard to accept that she is gone, and hard to see how we go on without her. But we will. Our great United Kingdom has a great future, because the Queen's spirit of strength, grace and resolve lives on in her people. One of the greatest privileges of being a member of this House was the chance to meet Her Majesty. Like when she visited Kingston on the occasion of her Golden Jubilee, or when I was deeply privileged to sit next to her at lunch at Windsor Castle.
We are going to leave the House of Commons now and take you to Hyde Park. Ceremonial event since the Queen died yesterday afternoon at Balmoral is about to take place. Gun salutes are about to ring out across the United Kingdom to mark the death of Queen Elizabeth II.